Today's episode is being recorded in the Goodman Library of the Oxford Union. The Oxford Union is a debating society which has hosted a wealth of illustrious speakers over its hundreds of years of history. And today, it allows students to come face to face with some of the most important intellectuals on the planet and listen to and sometimes even debate them. I myself have debated at the Oxford Union before, as you may have seen. They're currently running a fundraiser to help restore their Grade 2 listed building, and there's a link in the description if you want to help out. You were just on a panel for Unheard, talking about whether modern romance is dead. Was that the topic?
That was the title.
How did it go?
It was really good fun. I mean, personally speaking, it was great to be in a room. You know, I guess I got here by writing online. I'm behind the laptop typing away, and it was nice to be in a room full of people, talking, seeing their faces. And I guess you've said the same thing, like the best part of your job is speaking in rooms full of people. So it was good fun. And I think as far as the subject of the event goes, it was very, very good, very revealing, I think, about how things are.
Is modern romance dead? Was that the...
Or just is romance dead? Is romance dead?
Because a lot of people talk about like romance in the modern world, or like modern dating, or like modern this, modern that. What do you think people are getting at when they say modern romance, modern dating?
I see. Well, I think it's when they say modern romance, they mean romance now, as opposed to how it was 50, 100, 500 years ago, or at least as we think of it, right? So modern romance means dating apps, primarily. I think that's the thrust of it. And then you add to that the kind of broader sort of socio-political quakings through the manosphere, toxic masculinity, and these issues are kind of, if you like, the icing on the cake. But I feel like the fundament is basically just what the internet has done, and the online aspect, and people say modern.
Do you think it's actually changed
romance.
Anything about the way people love? I mean, we tend to romanticize romance, especially of the past.
Yeah.
And it kind of feels like something's different, but do you think it's purely a mechanistic difference, or do you think people are actually thinking differently about what romance is?
So I think it's definitely changed, and I will say why, but I also want to caveat that by kind of giving the caveat I always give, which is that the closer you look at how things are now and how they were in the past, the more you realize how little things have changed. I mean, or the overarching, the main impression I get from reading history is that nothing ever really changes. The things we complain about now and the way we complain about them are exactly the same as people have complained about them throughout all of history, even in terms of romance and love. You know, I sort of think maybe all material progress is an illusion, and it makes us think things are changing when really human nature is unchanging, and we're at the center of this vortex of kind of material distractions. That being said, I do think from time to time certain systems, certain technologies come along that either emphasize or de-emphasize bits of that unchanging human nature. So one way that online dating, I think, has fundamentally changed romance. I mean, there's a load of obvious ways, I guess, but one thing I find particularly interesting is the nature of communication. All right, once upon a time, if you wanted to talk to someone who wasn't in the same room as you could call them, of course, I suppose, but it was a lot more common to write letters. You know, if you look at any historical figure, anyone you admire from the past, you look at their biography, it's all letters, right? It's excerpts from a letter, whether it's their father, to their brother, to their agent, to their colleague, to their friend, to their professor, and of course to their lovers. And I don't know if you've read many love letters from the past, but they're usually, I mean, some of them are pretty prurient. You know, there's some famous cases of that. But on the whole, they're a lot more heartfelt, meaningful, and more detailed than the way we tend to text these days. And that's not to say people in the past were more considerate or sort of any better than us, but the technology forces you to do things differently. If you have to sit down in a room on your own with a piece of paper, right, and you're writing this to your loved one, to someone you're courting, let's say, right, it's you alone in a room with a pen and a bit of paper, you've got to actually look inside yourself a bit more in order to write something out, right? You don't have this instantaneous back and forth, you know, like, hi, what are you doing today? How was your day? That immediacy is gone, and I think that forces you to actually interrogate your feelings much deeper. No, I don't know how many people these days have actually sat down and tried to write a paragraph about the person they love or think they love. And you learn far more by doing that. You know, writing is a kind of thinking. And having lost that aspect now with the way not just dating, I suppose, but all messaging. I think the loss of letter writing as a whole, I'm not lamenting it for this sort of romantic image of, folding up the envelope and giving it to the postman and all that crap. No, it's just the purely technical side of how we interact with the technology. Letter writing, I think, has made us a lot less introspective. I guess we're more narcissistic than ever, but we're not introspective. There's a difference between introspection and narcissism. There's a difference between looking at yourself, curating this dating profile, and then always having images of yourself on your mind and trying to decide how you look. But there's a difference between that and sitting down and thinking, God, what do I think? What do I feel? So I think that's one way it's changed.
A friend of mine once said that, like, he was on dating apps and then he sort of just gave them up or deleted them, and said that he realized that dating apps were more about who likes you than who you like.
Sure.
And it is very sort of self-centered in that respect. A lot of people will use dating apps for validation, essentially, just to check that they've still got it. Are people still swiping? Do people still like me? That's something which you can't really get in such an immediate way in the past. You could kind of walk down the street and see if people are looking at you, but there's no just immediate way to check. Do people currently find me attractive? And
yeah, it's a shortcut. It's
got to be doing a number on people's psychology. I think the letter writing is interesting in that, like, when you write a letter, you have to create the entire message altogether. It's almost like having a conversation with somebody, but each person gets to speak for 10, 20 minutes at a time. It changes the nature of what you're saying, because in a conversation, including a text conversation, the other person dictates the direction of your thought. You say writing is a kind of thinking, and if the other person is constantly inputting and responsive to every single sentence, they are dictating the way that you're thinking. Conversations, I've sometimes compared them to being a little bit like a chess match, in that basically every chess match starts pretty much the same. There are incredibly common openings that, sometimes people do something a little bit strange, but it's pretty limited. And once you get past the first 4 or 5 moves, then you start getting into new territory. And near the end of a chess game, you're in a position that probably no other chessboard has ever been in the history of, like, mankind. And conversations work a bit like that. It's interesting how they all tend to start with the sort of, hey, how's it going? Or some variant of that. Do you push the king's pawn or the queen's pawn? Do you say hi? Do you say good morning? And they go off in these directions. But of course, it's responsive to what the other player does. And writing a letter is a bit like taking out that other side of the board and just being able to place the pieces on the chessboard at the end game wherever you want them straight away. And so it's much more of a considered and individual way of having a conversation. It allows you to sort of fully express everything that you wanted to say. Why don't people do that anymore?
Well, because the way we have always lived is that we fall to the lowest common denominator, or if you like, we fall to the most convenient denominator, and whatever's easiest, that is what we do, right? So it's easy to sit around here saying, oh no, what a shame that men don't wear suits anymore. What a shame that, we all drive rather than walking or taking, cycling. What a shame that we all text instead of writing letters. But it's easier, right? And it's just in our nature to do what is easier. I guess it's sort of hundreds of millions of years of evolution are very hard to override. And just because it's easy, like it is easier to text, right? I've never written you a letter. I consider you a good friend. I've never written you a letter. You've never written me one, but like maybe I should have done. Probably I should have done, but look, I haven't.
I hardly even respond to your texts.
That is true as well. Because it's convenient, right? But but funny enough, this is really important. I think this touches on the broader thing about dating and dating apps, is that they are, as a whole, not just in terms of this writing thing we're talking about, which is quite narrow, but as a whole, they're just more convenient. And that is why they suck and why no one likes it, because convenience, we're drawn to it almost against our will, kind of compelled by convenience, right? We just love, that's why we all go to the supermarkets, right? Once upon a time, you would have had, the greengrocers and the florists and the butchers and the guy selling nuts and the other one selling the cobbler and the shoe shine, all these different things. You go down a high street in some little village, there's like 50 different places you have to go to get what you need. These days, we just go to Tesco, or in your case, I suppose Waitrose or something.
I'm a Tesco's guy. Yeah. Have you ever?
But you see my point. That like whatever's convenient, we're drawn to it, and dating apps are just so convenient, and therefore they're also pretty boring. I think that's my biggest gripe with them, and I think people would agree, even those who use them a lot and maybe even had success. Look, I know couples who met on dating apps and they're wonderful and they're happy and they're very much in love. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think the bigger issue here is the convenience and the way it sort of systematizes romance. This was my big, that I spoke about on the panel. I don't know if you want to jump in, but maybe I'll just talk about this. Like the way it turns love and romance into something that you can schedule, right? People get home, okay, I'll go on the apps for half an hour. I'll see what happens. Okay, yeah, great, I've got a date. It's my third date in this month. It's been a good month then. Okay, and I'll put it in for Thursday at 6 p.m. And I think the idea that you can schedule love or romance is very obviously not just wrong, but pretty sad and pretty tragic, I think, because it's denying people what romance and love should give you, which is something I think by definition beyond the boundaries of ordinary life, of being scheduled, right? I have this line I say to my friends sometimes: it's not love if it's convenient. If it's real love, if it's real romance, then that means you've got to sacrifice things. It means you're going to miss meetings. It means you're going to be up late and you're going to be waking up tired, or whatever the hell it is. It means you're going to have to, drop out of something you said you're going to go to because you want to go and see this other person instead. That's love, that's romance. It's not convenient, but dating apps make us think, okay, it's something that we can schedule. And then the way we talk about it on the podcasts, on the shows, online, all this dating advice, bloody hell, it's pretty disgusting, I think, and it's a shame. Disgusting is a strong word, but I mean, it's just a shame that people talk about romance and dating and give advice as if it's a game that can be played. It's a system which, if you fine tune, just if you twist all the dials in the right way, then you're going to find. And obviously, usually it comes from all this advice is kind of men speaking to men. Men have been led to believe that if they fine tune themselves and if they schedule everything correctly, then they'll, I don't know, find love, I guess. But who believes that? I don't know. I don't know if anyone really believes that.
Optimizing for the dating market. The dating market is a phrase that gets thrown around quite a lot, and think about that for a second. The dating market, it's the sort of a consumerist analogy for relationships. And from what you're saying, it sounds like love is not something to which a consumerist analogy could ever appropriately apply.
Yeah, no, not love. I mean, it's funny you mention. I guess we are literally anyone who uses the apps, dating apps. We are customers if we're doing it. I mean, they are corporations, right? And we're using it. We get adverts. They have a system which they use to make money. So if you are using, you are literally not even speaking as an analogy, but you are literally a customer in the dating market. That being said, of course, I'm sure your very perceptive and well-read listeners will know dating markets aren't exactly a new thing. If you look, I don't think in the 16th century there was much in the way of romance in these marriages that were organized between the big aristocratic families. It was purely, or at least chiefly, about power and about what was most expedient, which is in a way even more what's the word? Even more materialistic, or even more consumerist.
Oh yeah,
than we have now,
But that's why the love stories that are popular from these time periods and onwards tend to have this motif of something which isn't allowed.
And exactly.
Not because it's like taboo, not because you're gay, but because it's out of line with the family organization.
And therefore it's real, and therefore it's real love. One of the most famous medieval romances, I'm sure you know it, Tristan and Isolde. I don't. So I can't remember. It's sort of one of these romances which is written again and again and again, and it's actually set in Britain. But I think the most famous version of it is a German epic written in the 13th century. Wagner made it into an opera. One of his most beautiful operas that changed music forever, with the famous Tristan chord. Anyway, but that's about a knight who's sent by the king to go and escort his bride to be. Right, but then so he goes to escort this bride to be, and Tristan and the bride Isolde fall in love. And it all ends pretty tragically, I think. I can't remember exactly. Maybe there were different endings. But the point being, yes, right? That's good. It's literally, even in those days, people recognized that this dating market, this marriage market, wasn't about love. And therefore, the stories they read about love were something forbidden, as they are today. I mean, what every single song is about love, right? Every single film is about love. Why do we go to the cinema and watch these TV shows and films about love and listen to songs about love? You know, it's very rare that they're about people who met on dating apps, I guess. And when they are, it's usually comedy, I suppose, because it can be quite funny. And also, sorry, on that point about historical parallels, that we're not talking about some sort of idealized, lost, way society of love that we've now replaced with our dating apps. It was maybe no different in the past. Look at Henry VIII and his wives. The famous case of the portrait of Catherine of Aragon. I guess she seems very beautiful. Henry meets her in person, and he says, "Oh dear, you don't look quite like you did in the portrait I saw of you."
He was catfished.
Yes, exactly. He was, literally, and I suppose it was easier to do it in those days than it is now. So it's not like things were perfect in the past, and I really don't mean to say that at all. But that doesn't mean there are things that we've lost that we can learn from, or at least parallels to draw, which help us see most clearly what we're missing. Because I think everyone would agree that we're missing something, right? How often do you hear somebody say, "You know what? Romance in the 21st century is great. I love the apps. I love dating apps. I love the way we represent ourselves online. All this stuff." No one. Do people say that? I guess not.
But has anyone ever said that? What the reason I'm asking about this concept of modern love is that we were just talking about how it used to be that these love stories were real because they were against the typical structure of families deciding who their children are going to marry. In those days, people wouldn't have said, "Oh, I love how our romantic system is set up, that everyone's, marrying the proved." But obviously it's a unique situation we're in. I think that, I understand when people say nothing ever changes and history repeats itself and human nature is still the same, but I do think that there are some genuinely revolutionary moments to pinpoint in human history. One of them is the invention of the internet and its revolutionary effect on communication technology. And I think that might do something qualitative to how we love each other. But it's never been the case that people have looked around and gone I'm really happy with how this is all going. I'm really happy with the state of modern love.
Exactly. I mean, no one's ever said that about anything. I mean, there's a line in my upcoming book, which is something like when you read history, you learn that nobody was ever happy because of their times. They were always happy despite, or at least notwithstanding, their times. And I think that's as true now as it ever was.
Yeah, I
especially with romance.
Should mention the book that you've got coming out. It will be available for pre-order probably at some point, maybe even right now.
Hopefully by the time people listen to this, it will be available.
However it's announced, the link will be in the description.
Yeah, and we can flash a cover.
That would be great.
Over there, we can have it, appearing now as I say these words somehow.
It's just floating somewhere in between us.
Gorgeous, isn't it?
It's a beautiful looking cover that you've got there. Brilliant use of colour. You were just speaking a moment ago about supermarkets, right? And the sort of convenience overcoming our desire for beauty. It is interesting how everybody simultaneously knows that convenience is destructive of meaning, purpose, beauty, all of this kind of stuff.
Everything.
And yet choose it every single time. And it's the depressing thing about the swift tide of modernity is that it is irreversible. Once cars have been invented, you just can't go back to a horse and carriage unless it's some kind of novelty with some poor abused horse in New York City running around Central Park. You can't go back. How then do we regain what was so good about the love of the past now? Things like the letter writing, things like that feeling that absence makes the heart grow fonder. It's like if you spend so much time away, when you finally see each other, it's beautiful and romantic. Whereas today, now it's like, I've got to text every single day and I've got to check my phone and I've got to, and it sort of has a totally different kind of vibe.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you, maybe we can actually talk about that convenience stuff as it applies more broadly to society, to art, to architecture.
Oh yeah, in fact, have you heard of the fake clock towers on supermarkets in the UK?
I've not. I mean, I've seen them.
You know what I'm talking about,
Yeah,
right?
My Morrisons. I remember where I grew up, and there was the Scunthorpe. There was the Morrisons. I remember every time you drove into town, there'd be a clock tower.
So they've got these they're quite beautiful. They look like village churches
Yeah,
or
no,
something. And they've got a clock tower, and it's like a Tesco. It's like a supermarket. It's like the equivalent of like, I guess, like a Walmart or something or Target in the US. Have you ever noticed those clocks don't work?
Never noticed.
Those clocks, like, they basically never tell the correct time because they're not actually clock towers. What happened was, in the 1970s, a town in Essex, I pulled it up here, called South Woodham Ferrers, was being laid out in Essex, and there were like strict rules about what you're allowed to do because it's a nice little town, and so it kind of, I don't know the exact rules, it kind of had to look a bit like a barn, it had to use a particular brickwork, it had to be in keeping with the style of the town. And when Tesco come along and want to build a supermarket, supermarkets are known for being these horrible utilitarian buildings, and they said, no, you're not allowed, you have to make it fit in. So they basically faked this like beautiful looking building. It looks like a barn with a clock tower. And because they didn't actually care for keeping the time, most of those clocks just don't even work anymore. I'm not even sure if they worked in the first place. That's why if you ever drive past one of these supermarkets, see if the clock actually works, because half the time they're not even there. And this is an example of somebody sticking their foot down and saying, I know supermarkets are more convenient, but recognizing the trade-off that has brought. One trade-off is, of course, you don't go to the market and your individual salesman. And obviously that would be a massive pain if you actually need to get your shopping done. But there was something probably romantic about walking around, saying hello to your local butcher, you know. But another thing that has been lost is the fact that because it's so utilitarian, it's just like one big building and it's a conglomerate that doesn't care about beauty. And so this is one example of how, knowing that, you can fight against it by saying, okay, you can build a Tesco, but you have to make it look like a clock tower. And the clock doesn't even need to bloody work. I don't care. Just make it look beautiful. Is there something like that we could do to bring back love, man, letter writing, all of that kind of good stuff?
I guess that's a wonderful example, and the kind of thing we should probably do more often. I mean, I think this conversation is so really overdone. You know, every single time you open your web browser or go on whatever BBC News, there's an article about how dating apps are causing all this harm and sending everyone crazy and stuff. So again, we all know it's a problem. How do you solve it? Well, I think in a way the good news is that it's not that hard, right? I mean, things are now also better than they've ever been before in so many different ways, and in many ways, all you have to do is just not use one, right? You just don't use the apps, and that forces you to actually live in the real world. Same with like the supermarket thing. Like, I can sit here moaning about supermarkets, but if I really wanted to, there are still butchers. I could go to the butcher to get my sausages rather than going to Tesco, whatever it is. Same with dating. You refuse to use the apps, right? It's scary. You've got to be bold. You've got to be courageous. You've got to live in the real world and take chances and see what the hell happens. But it can be done, and it works. I mean, we all know people who've met their partners in real life, which is, again, such a strange phrase to use, right? The idea that you have to specify, oh yeah, we met in real life. My partner and I have a very, very odd thing that we can now say in 2025. I don't think it's any more complicated. I mean, there may be some issues further down the line, and at the panel I did, there was some really interesting discussions where there was some men in the audience who I was kind of saying this, you know, like just forget the apps, go out there into the real world and live and see what happens, and be willing to embrace the inconvenience of romance. And then some men in the audience were like, well, we feel uncomfortable approaching women and that sort of thing. And then we got into the whole, I mean, that kind of took the discussion in a different direction. I guess it's not really the kind of thing you normally talk about on your channel, although it's adjacent, I suppose. Issues of masculinity and toxic masculinity, and the relationship between men and women. I don't know if you want to talk about that. It's certainly a very interesting, but it's very depressing.
What do you think is going on? I mean, you mentioned earlier this, you said disgusting when you described, I can't remember exactly what you were describing, but it was something about the way that...
It was about how when dating has been turned into something that you schedule.
Yeah, and like...
It's the whole sort of podcaster, for want of a better word. I realise that's low-hanging fruit to say that, but the sort of mentality of like, you wake up at this time and you do this and then you do this, and the whole productivity, the whole spectrum of productivity, which on the whole, I guess, has been good for people. But the whole productivity way of being and thinking, which I guess has taken over the world, or at least the West, I guess, in the last 10 years, has pushed out. And I think that's what when I used the word disgusting, I meant the way romance has been turned into something you can schedule.
What's so resonant for so many people then, like with things like the manosphere and the dating market and the optimizing for approaching women and all of this kind of stuff. Like, why is that exciting to people if the thing that used to excite people were stories about people sneaking off in the night to elope with their lover?
Sure. I mean, those stories still do excite people. I mean, just look at what's on in the cinema, the kind of things people watch when they're at home on Amazon Prime or whatever it is, wherever we get our TV these days. The romantic stuff hasn't changed much, I don't think, in the last 3,000 years, since the dawn of storytelling. Romance stories have been more or less the same. Why do you find that exciting? Like, why does it appeal? The kind of the manosphere way of being. I think, gosh, where to begin? I think one is that the alternative probably hasn't been presented. Like, this stuff is kind of about education. Like, I'm not saying I'm exactly a paragon of romantic love and sort of a different kind of masculinity. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I definitely have a different view to a lot of people my age, a lot of young gentlemen our age, and that's probably just because when I was a young boy, I spent most of my time in secondhand bookshops, like reading these old books, and I think through them I got a kind of education, like unwittingly, but I got a different kind of education than I would have got had I spent all those formative years watching sitcoms, or as young people do now, just scrolling Instagram. I think without meaning to, I kind of stumble into a slightly more old-fashioned, but I think fundamentally timeless way of thinking about things. Again, I don't uphold all these values, and I'm not even saying that it's about values, but just ways of thinking about the world and ways of being. So I think it's to do with education. If people haven't ever seen anything different, how could they know that there is anything different?
So who writes well on love?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Now we're talking. Well, I remember one of the first things I read that really moved me on love was Dante. So the Divine Comedy, you all know it. Which I think is always kind of misunderstood. I mean, the whole thing. So Dante, from Florence, born in 1265, he falls in love with the young Beatrice Portinari. He's absolutely devoted to her. She dies very, very young. Dante later marries a woman called Gemma, I think, and has children. We only know about Gemma because of the historical records. Dante never mentions her once in all his writings. It's Beatrice he loves. And the whole of, as far as I can tell, the whole of the Divine Comedy is basically his attempt to reshape Christian theology around his love for Beatrice, to justify the fact that he seems to see God through her. It's remarkable. But something else he wrote first, I think when he was 25. Well, no, he was 27. He wrote something called La Vita Nuova, The New Life. And it's kind of a poetical treatise. It was partly written to introduce a new style of poetry that him and his friends were coming up with in Florence in the 13th century. This kind of vernacular Italian style of poetry, which was then pretty revolutionary. It was partly to justify that, but it was also about his love for Beatrice. And he was writing about, and there's this one sort of funny scene in La Vita Nuova when he describes going to a party, I think, or some sort of the 13th century Florentine equivalent, and Beatrice is there with her friends, and he's nearby, and they all look at him, and they're kind of whispering, and they start laughing, and he just bursts into tears and like leaves the party and throws himself on his bed. And I know, I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but I thought that particular little scene was beautiful because it kind of made me realize, hold on, this is the kind of thing that happens now. We haven't changed that much. People still get so ashamed, and they overthink things, and they worry when they see the person they like. They're kind of laughing. I mean, God, they must be laughing at me. Anyway, forget a lot. I think Dante writes very, very beautifully on love, and he wrote about it with such a tenderness and a gravity and a weight, which I think we're kind of losing now. I mean,
that's what's missing from all of this manosphere crap, is like the tenderness. Which is supposed to be about love, because I suppose tenderness is like soft and mushy and feminine and does not optimize you for, competing for the top 20% of women on the Tinder app or whatever. Like, and there is something to be said for the fact that, like, if you just like try to like do the romantic thing, if you're like, no, I'm not like these other guys, I'm tender and I'm soft, then it is actually just a bit mushy and unattractive. So it's kind of
no, I agree. It's got to be authentic.
It's sort of a difficult thing to.
But I think this romantic stuff, as we're calling it, is authentic. But the point is, it's an authentic access to a way of thinking and a way of loving and a way of feeling that the current manosphere system doesn't give you access to if you're a man. It's not that you're doing it for the sake of it. The point is, these romantic gestures I mean, letters and like flowers, and I mean, these are all very, very sort of stereotypical examples. You know, so we're sort of contrasting that with the whole. There were plenty of stereotypes from either side, but anyway, these grand romantic gestures aren't about doing it for the sake of doing it in order to be romantic. The point of them is that they're kind of symbols of deeper feelings, which are harder to give voice to, which are harder to explain. Right? That's the meaning of any of these things. That we do, and then at that point you can kind of talk about the whole meaning of symbols and tradition and even beauty, which we're losing across society. This is the rule of modernity and the rule of convenience, is that you lose everything, and I guess that's the value of these romantic gestures, is that they would allow men to the tenderness thing is so interesting.
Who else then
Sure.
writes well on love? Because I love everything you just said about Dante. I think what is it you said, that like he seems to sort of reorient Christian theology.
He reshaped Christian theology around his love for Beatrice.
He said something about how he like saw God through her or something, which is just such.
Well, what happens? He goes through hell.
Yeah.
Goes through purgatory. Who meets him at the top of purgatory? Right. Virgil says, farewell, Dante. I can't help you anymore. Here's Beatrice, your great love.
Yes.
She's going to take you to heaven.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine the magnitude of that passion. The word passion. I think it's funny. Like, words are so interesting in this whole the dating advice, dating market culture. All these books about them, all these podcasts about them. Like, think of the words that we use. I don't think words. I don't know. I guess I don't listen to a lot of it. So maybe you do. I'm not sure. But words like passion or adventure. I don't know if they're used very often, but
I watch how to pick up women videos every single evening, and I don't think I've heard those words used once.
Tenderness and sweetness and gentleness, but these are parts of the human condition also, and I think they're a major part of masculinity. I mean, there's this wonderful. I was talking to someone about it the other day. It seems like the kind of conversation I would have had with you, but I don't think it was. Maybe it was David. Anyway, well, if you take this sort of the ideal modern man if you sort of took AI and said, please, well, a person could do it, of course, I guess, but listen to all these podcasts, watch all these videos, and like create the ideal modern man. What would he be like? How would he act? And how would he behave? Then you take that and compare it to the medieval ideal of a knight. And again, I know we're talking in ideals here, and I recognize that not all medieval knights were like this, but at least in terms of what they said they wanted to be like, right? Sort of humility and modesty and gentleness were major parts of the code of chivalry, right? When you read these romances, these knights were, in some sense, hyper-masculine because they walked around with swords, wearing armor, literally fighting to the death with other men and going to war. But at the same time, in the presence of women and even in the presence of other men, they could be very tender, and they were supposed to be, they're expected to be able to compose poetry and write songs, and that element of gentleness and tenderness, which is present in the medieval ideal of masculinity, has kind of disappeared now. And
but people famously find artsy people attractive, especially like stereotypically women find men who like can write poetry, play the guitar, like
play the guitar,
these kinds of artistic types of skills. I mean, they also find people attractive who are like good at sports and stuff. That's probably more like manosphere-y, like dominance and physical fitness and kind of stuff. But there's also that sort of soft attractiveness to the person who does art, and there's something that seems to be tying together like the arts and romance. And I wonder if you think that being in touch with art and music and poetry and stuff makes you more like able to access this kind of love that you're talking about, or if it's like the other way around.
No, I think
being in love makes you appreciate the arts.
The things you consume like completely change who you are, right? And like, I mean, God, this is not very hard to imagine the difference. But let's say, you're a young man, and your view of women has been shaped by films, TV shows, Instagram, and probably if you're a young man, by pornography. Okay, that's how you've come to understand women before you've probably ever really spoken to one, in real life in any serious way. Now imagine if instead of those things, your view of them had been shaped by, and maybe it sounds strange to people that this could even be possible, and maybe it sounds strange or pathetic, but it's true. Imagine your view had been shaped by poetry and by the great novels and by art as well, right? Imagine the difference. I mean, look, plenty of art is pretty pornographic, and I think a lot of 19th, 18th century art, it was sort of the closest they could get to it before it was possible. But that being said, if your view of women has been shaped by pornography or paintings, I mean, look at some of the great pre-Raphaelite painters. We're here in Oxford, in the Oxford Union. Just do there in the old library. You've got the great murals by a bunch of pre-Raphaelite painters.
Mhm.
Look at Rossetti's painting of women. Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Look at his paintings of his beloved Lizzie Siddal. You know, he loved her, and she died. And just the sheer, I'll use this word again, the magnitude of passion and devotion in his paintings of her. It can't fail to move you if you've got a heart. And if you're a young man and the way you've been taught by the things you've consumed to shape women, if that's Rossetti's paintings of Elizabeth Siddal, or it's pornography, right? That's going to affect how you act, how you think, what you even believe is possible, what you know to be possible.
What you desire.
Well, yeah, what you desire. I think so.
What you think you desire.
But I think what you think you desire, because these are aberrations, but I think they're aberrations, and you can come back to the true course. And I think men maybe deep down know this. They are deeply dissatisfied. Like, pornography is worse for you than smoking. It's just about the worst thing there is, I think, for a man. I think it's terrible. And so going back to the original question of, I guess, how to find this alternative way.
Not to mention how bad it is for women as well. That's another thing that kind of, I think, gets lost in the discussion, in the sort of manosphere discussion. Pornography comes up a lot, and how utterly harmful it is. Well, why is it so harmful? Well, it gives you erectile dysfunction, and it ruins your interactions with women, and it makes you, naturally less able to approach. It's like, have we also just forgotten that it is also just this hub of trafficking of women? I think like the badness for women often gets left out of that.
Oh,
conversation
completely.
And that's the main thing.
That's the main thing, sure.
But you're right that must have an effect. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how pornography and our sort of cultural addiction to it has affected the way people have sex. It changes what people expect. Women report men choking them and just expecting that that's just the normal thing to do and not even asking first, or this kind of stuff. And that's new. That has to be pornography. But I don't think I really hear discussed how it might affect, like, love, do you think that the topic of sex is as attached to the topic of romance historically as it is today? Seems like we've got less of a taboo about talking about sex, and so maybe not so much in the past, or if so, kind of implicitly.
It's less taboo now, but it's always been there implicitly, always in all the art. And maybe the beauty of that art and literature is, and way of thinking about it is that, taboos serve a very powerful purpose, all right? Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. Look at, of course, the thing where you don't say Voldemort's name, makes him more scarier. But sometimes taboos, I think, help you, because some things kind of shouldn't be said or can't be said. Nietzsche had those great lines, although translated apparently inaccurately, but very lovingly by Harold Bloom. Something like, what is it? It's something like, as soon as you speak, then the feeling that those words are giving voice to is already dead. Something along those lines. Like, if you say something, it's already dead within you. To be able to say it means it's gone, and it's kind of like a slightly troubling idea, but there's some truth to that. And I think some things ellipsis is so powerful. It's such a powerful rhetorical and literary tool. So, like, imagine there's a shot of you on Friday night, like just leaving work. And there's a film about Alex Connor, shot Friday, leaves work, shot Monday morning. You're like flat out on the sofa, in a mess. It's like, okay, he's had a wild weekend. You understand that just like that. You don't need to show it all. And in a way, it's actually more effective just to show the two shots.
They call that ellipsis?
I think that's called ellipsis.
Yeah, I've noticed that in one area I keep seeing that kind of thing, and I think this is how to avoid cheesiness in films. I realised, this might be a bit of a detour, but like, I was thinking about how to write scenes that involve like quite dramatic moments of culmination, either telling someone that their child has died at war, or finally saying I love you, or asking somebody out, or something like that. And it's very difficult not to make it cheesy and clunky, because in real life those moments are cheesy and clunky. I don't know if you've ever had to tell someone that someone they know has died. There's no like proper formal way to do it. It is just a bit sort of like, bit of a bugger this really. It's clunky and it makes for difficult viewing. And so unless you're just going to own that, the easiest way to do it is to show the car coming up the driveway and, you know, the woman whose husband has been at war looking shocked, and then immediately it just cuts to her crying because you sort of know what it means. I can't remember exactly who I was talking to recently about how this is really well done in the UK Office when Tim asks Dawn out, and you know they've got like the microphones on, and he finally builds up the confidence. He walks in, he says, "Come into this room," and they just take off the microphones. And then he just like walks out and just sort of looks at the camera and goes like, "She said no, you know, by the way," and then walks off. And it's so much more powerful because you don't have to try to invent what would be this quite clunky...
Because words aren't actually the same thing as the thing we're feeling. We sort of think words, but they're not the same thing as the great, you know, ancient Greek philosopher Cratylus knew. He thought words were so useless that he just famously waggled his fingers and he refused to talk.
Yeah, and the thing that makes for good TV is conveying the feeling, which in a real situation like that, where somebody is, you know, asking somebody out or something, the only person who's feeling that thing is going to be them, and the words will never actually be a proper representation of the feeling. And so if you try to represent it on TV with the words, you get something kind of clunky and inaccurate.
It's not just clunky, I think it's always disappointing. It's
that's a better
always
word.
Unfulfilling. It's like, well, yeah, like fulfillment is such an interesting concept, I guess, in art and in real life. But yeah, it's always disappointing to show it, I think, which is why, going back to where we started, which is why ellipsis is so powerful, which is why taboos around... So, like, you know, even when you read the Victorian stuff, the famously prudish society, and you know, I guess we're kind of still raised in that anti-Victorian mindset, which has dominated this country for the past 100 years, where we're sort of raised to view them as very hypocritical, because on the surface they had this morality where they refused to, you know, like, for example, when they translated the ancient Romans from Latin into English, the Romans were very filthy in everything they wrote, right? When the Victorians translated them, they sanitized the language, the poetry of Catullus, whatever. But even when you read the Victorian stuff, it's very evident. You know, like if you actually use your brain a little bit, you can see when they're referencing things that are taboo, like sex. And I think in a way it's what makes that historical art maybe more powerful and more meaningful and more exciting. Look at, like, Wagner, again, to mention him, his operas, especially the Ring Cycle, they're punctuated by moments that are very, very, I guess, erotic. You know, like at the end of, I guess, Siegfried, when he goes to the mountaintop and walks through the flames and he's united with Brunhilde, right? You don't see them making love on stage.
Knowing each other in the biblical sense.
Yeah, exactly. But it's implied. But then the kind of mythical setting of it, and the way they sing about their feelings, and the nature of the union, is really impactful. And I think more ultimately moving and impactful than if in the 21st century, of course, you know, if we make a TV show or a film where we just show everything. Really, we're very, very prurient now. I mean, we like the details of these things, and I guess it's just disappointing. And worst of all, I think it's a bit boring. You know, it's boring to just put the thing down as it is. It's the beauty of ellipsis, and it's the beauty of all these older forms of art where there's always something more you can't quite see, you can't quite say. And I think that elevates romance and love. And certainly what we like now is in the 21st century. I don't think we were raised to talk about it in these terms, and culturally there's very little belief in the transcendental power of love, I think, now, which is a shame because it's there. And I think people know this as well. People know it's there, but we don't talk about it. I mean, it's hard to talk about, but you think you can direct people towards it or away from it. And I think to take everything we've just been talking about and return to dating apps, it's just a little bit boring.
You know, when you just talked about this censorship in translations by the Victorians, it made me think of, I just spoke to Dermot McCulloch, the historian of the church, and in his recent book about a history of sex in Christianity,
Wow.
he points out that there's this verse in the book of Ezekiel which says something like, she lusted after her lovers whose genitalia were like donkeys and whose emissions were like those of a horse. It's like this very explicit sort of donkey language describing genitalia. And when Thomas Cranmer puts together the Book of Common Prayer, he systematizes a way of like getting through the Bible like day by day, but he omits a few parts, and he omits this verse from Ezekiel and says, I quote, that it is, he omits those parts which are the least edifying and might best be spared and therefore are left unread. It just made me think of that interesting sort of tidbit of censorship history. My brain was just thinking about the fact that, yeah, okay, in the same way that it's really easy to get up and say like dating apps and marketplace and come on, everyone just go to the gym and women will like you. It's just as easy to say, oh, that's also stupid. Oh, and the manosphere doesn't have a good, relationship to love and all of this kind of stuff. And I don't want to make this too cheap because, like, there is some truth in it, right? Like,
absolutely.
Men who go to the gym are stereotypically, maybe even just typically, more attractive, all other things being equal, to women. Some women say, actually, I prefer a dad bod, I prefer this. That's certainly true, but like, there's got to be something to it. There's got to be something to the fact that if you are a more like confident person and you watch classes on how to become more charismatic, to the extent that they might actually work, which a lot of the time they probably don't, that must actually do something. That it's not like it's this completely like baseless movement of people who are totally confused. Like, it does work in some respect. At the very least, the people who a lot of young men are looking up to for advice, even if the advice is kind of like dead or silly, the qualities that they are admiring in that person will not be their tenderness and their ability to quote long passages of Dante, but their biceps and their confidence, right? Mm-hmm. So there's got to be something in it.
Yeah, I first will say that I agree that I don't want to make it seem like I'm just crapping on the whole thing and saying it's all worthless. That's obviously not the case. I think maybe sometimes I speak a little bit strongly because it is so dominant, and I think it's important to represent not even a mutually exclusive alternative, but at least partially exclusive and certainly alternative way of being that is underrepresented. Sure, yeah, of course there's value in it, and I mean, how many the highest level, how many lives have been saved by this sort of thing? I'd have thought a lot. How many lives have been improved? A lot. I mean, it's just better to be healthier, and going to the gym is part of that, and all this other associated stuff. I think there's virtue there, but certainly in as much as it relates to dating, I think one of the problems with this conversation, with most conversations of this nature, is that we're constantly trying to provide catch-all solutions or catch-all. This is what men are like. This is what women are like. This is what men want. This is what women want. This is obviously. I mean, this is very obviously not true. That is basically impossible to speak in those general. In such sweeping terms.
I think you can like statistically generalize.
Oh, don't give me statistics. I think that's part of the problem, though.
But it's maybe just like an unhelpful way to think about it, even if it's true. Mm-hmm. There are some things which like statistics might point you in a particular direction, and it might involve a kind of self-deception. Maybe that's just what love needs, man. Like, sometimes it's just not a helpful like framework by which to think about things.
So what isn't? Sorry,
like if there are statistical facts about things that people are attracted to, or things
like what? I see.
Like, I don't know, if there was some statistic about body shape or something. Like, it may just be true that there is a statistically preferable body shape for women.
Okay, true, but irrelevant.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
true.
It's like
it's like so what? It's like, who cares about what this is carry on. I feel like
what I was just thinking is that, like, in the way I'm saying, well, there's got to be some truth in this. There's also some truth in, like, the medieval way of setting up marriage. Like, you want, like, the medieval red pill. It's like, son, I know that you think you're in love, but this is a fleeting emotion, which is a terrible thing to build a relationship on. Like, have you got any money? Has she got any money? Because if you don't, you're going to have these arguments. Are your values aligned? Like, think about how people might talk today. It's like, you know, I'm gonna be real with you here. You know, like, you got to have a conversation about whether you know, is she a feminist and you're a conservative? Like, red pill, bro. Like, down the line, that's going to cause you trouble, because when you raise some children, you know, you've got to be. It's all very sort of like practical wisdom, and in a way, that has more in common with the way that people would have viewed marriage before. In saying, like, okay, there's like this happy-go-lucky love stuff, which, like, great, that's very fun and all, but, like, switch your brain on for a second and you'll realize this is a better way of doing things. But the romantic says it's just not a better way of doing things, even if it's true. Even if it's true that I'm not going to have any money and that I'm going to have trouble raising my kids. It's like...
That is what the romantic... And I think it's really important what you mentioned there, right? Because this love stuff, romance, it's not necessarily good.
Yeah, but that's it, right? It's like,
that's the point.
If you want to say, like, well, all of this kind of, you know, properly organizing marriages around, like, what makes sense familially and in terms of money, and this dating market stuff about statistics and, you know, making yourself a more viable person and increasing your sperm count, that's not what love's all about. Some people might go like, okay, then love is a fool's errand, and we should be focusing on the other stuff, which is kind of the attitude.
But I think that's actually you've got to have true love. Like, it, as I said, it's not convenient, right? Like, true love just completely upends your life. Like, all the things you thought you believed in, suddenly, like, I don't know if I do, and the things you're supposed to care about, you don't know if you do care about them anymore, and it keeps you awake at night. You worry, you get stressed, and you get really sad. But then also you're related in a way you never have been before. No, this is so important. Like, yeah, people think they want love, but I think maybe they don't. Maybe they do just want something more stable and successful, which is, this isn't about better or worse, but that's also to be praised. But yeah, I think we've got to recognize that.
Yes, remember the true love of Paris and Helen of Troy launched 1,000 ships.
Well, that wasn't true love. I think because Paris gave... You know, at the wedding of, who was it? Achilles' mother and whoever it was. Paris, you know, as Strife gives the golden apple and says, this belongs to the fairest. The goddesses go to Paris. He picks Aphrodite. I think Athena promises him, like, political dominion, and I can't remember what the other one promises him. And then Aphrodite promises him the most beautiful woman in the world. If he chooses her for the apple, he gives her the apple. So he gets Helen. She doesn't even like. That's the funny thing about the Iliad. Helen's just constantly moaning about how much of a coward and how much of an idiot of Paris is. And then it's a funny book there. Really funny.
But Paris loves Helen.
Yeah, he seems to love her.
And he seemed relatively willing.
And look, hey, look, man, we got a big war.
Look what happened.
We got a bloody good book from it. A load of great poetry.
That's true.
You know, it's like Orson Welles says in The Third Man. You seen The Third Man?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Great film, directed by Carol Reed, written by Graham Greene. I think it was once voted the best British film ever made. Set in Vienna in 1947. It's just an amazing film. Anyway, there's a line in it where Orson Welles, his character, he says, and his friend is kind of having a go at him because he's indulging in a life of crime. And he's like, look, in Italy in the 15th century, in the 16th century under the Medici and the Borgias and all these warring families, and there was all this strife, chaos, conquering, plague, all of this, right? Despite all of the political chaos and strife, you got the Renaissance. And then he says in Switzerland, you know, 500 years of peace and brotherly love, and what do you get? The cuckoo clock, basically. It's a nice way of thinking about the difference between peace and war.
So should we...
Okay, that's one hell of a tangent, but I think it might bring us back around.
Should we be going after love then?
Yeah, exactly.
The way that you've just described it, like, if you were talking to a robot who had no feeling of love, and they said, oh, what is this love thing? You said, well, love completely upends your life. It's inconvenient. It rubs against the grain. It sometimes involves self-deception. It involves abandoning your family and betraying your friends. And it can launch wars. And the robot's like, so I don't get it. What are you doing this for? And you're just like, it just feels good, man. Like, Is that a good enough justification?
Maybe not, but it's the most alive you can ever feel. The most alive, I think. The most like burningly and deeply alive in a way. It's transcendental. And it's funny you mention the thing you've got to experience it. I guess it's like any sort of argument from experiences. It's like meditating. You know, people. I mean, I've never tried it, but people talk about meditating from the Hindu or Buddhist tradition. It's like you can't actually understand it just by reading about it. But once you've meditated and you've connected to the universal one, then you'll understand it. Or if you're a propagandist for drugs, I guess it's like, you know, trying to convince someone to take psychedelics. It's like, you know, you won't know until you've done it, and then you'll see it. I guess ultimately love is the same thing. It's just that we have this wealth of material going back to the beginning of human civilization about how good it is, because it feels great. But yeah, it is destructive. I don't know.
You're obsessed with drugs, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're just obsessed.
Love. Well, love is a drug, they say, which is, I think, true, but kind of it's a bit of a boring cliche.
I think it's probably easier to imagine when you think about the love that a parent has for a child, in that it's a different kind of love, of course, one hopes. But when you say things like, yeah, like it's really impractical and you've got to quit your job if you want to provide, and you've got to, you know, like give up your pastimes to work a second job to raise money so your kid can go to college or whatever. And I think there's kind of no question about whether that's the right thing to do for most people, because even if you haven't experienced the love of a child, people understand that it is just one of the most powerful psychological, biological drives that exists.
But you have to sacrifice a lot for a child, right?
Exactly, that's what I mean. And I think it's easier to accept that, because in a way,
Got you.
Once you have a child, it's your child, and there's this feeling of like, there's like no choice in the matter. The reason it feels more like a choice you have to make, whether it's worth making that sacrifice for romantic love, is because you could love this person or not. You could cut them out of your life and they would have nothing to do with you. And there's no connection. They're not biologically related. There's nothing, and you get to make that choice. But if you've decided or found out that you do love them as powerfully as, you know, you might love a child or something, people trivially would do all kinds of things for their son or their daughter. And I guess that's probably the way that people treat romantic love too. But it is irrational.
It's rational. I think, yes, maybe a nice way to kind of just not put a lid on that exactly, but to kind of summarize, I think, what this conversation is driving towards. It's not so much even directing people towards that thing entirely, but it's at least recognizing that it does exist and it is possible, and laying it down as an option that may be worth pursuing, and saying that even in the 21st century, in 2025, this overwhelming transcendental love can still be achieved and is worth, I think maybe I do have to say, and I do think it is worth aiming at, and I do think it is better than the alternatives. I mean, I certainly hope that if anybody is still listening and wonders if it is possible and worth pursuing, I think it is. And it's risky, but what is worth having that isn't risky in the pursuit of it? You know, you obviously have to sacrifice things and you may have to lose things, but that's true of all in life that's worth having. And there's a really interesting kind of parallel here between religious language, I think, and the language we use to talk about love. They're very similar. And even in this practical sense, I mean, if you were to follow Christian scripture to the word, you would have to, like, you tell me if I'm wrong, Alex, you're an expert, but you'd have to give up all your possessions, right? And you'd have to stop pursuing any sort of material career in life and go and live among the poor and the sickly. And if I told my mother I wanted to quit my job, well, not that I really have a real job, but stop doing whatever the hell I'm doing, give away everything I have, and go and live with, like, the sick and the poor, she'd be more upset than if I said I wanted to run away, you know, elope with someone I love, I think. Anyway, that's just something that occurred to me then, this interesting parallel between a true embrace of religion and of love. But this has also reminded me of something else. Just something else I can go back to on, just maybe a quite interesting point, I think, about why this kind of love is, we don't talk about it as much. We find it harder maybe to achieve, perhaps. Something you mentioned earlier, I think you've got to be willing to die for it. And I think most people would accept, I'd like to think, at least notionally, that they would be willing to die for their child. But I don't know how often people would be willing to die for much else in the modern world. I think everything in the 21st century, we sort of live as if the point of life is to live for as long as possible. Like, the end game of life is to keep living, is how we treat it. right? It's like everything we do is fine-tuned towards making us safer and healthier, which is obviously good up to a point, but you can go too far. There are so many different examples of this, and one of the most interesting is with like fire safety. Okay, we don't want our buildings to burn down because it's awful. It's awful. But equally, if you make a building as fire safe as possible, it's not a building you would want to live in, right? And I think that's true of life more generally. And I think we're really heading towards a society that prioritizes life itself too highly. And there's Juvenal has this great line. I wish I could quote it in Latin, but I can't. But it's something like, what is it? For the sake of living, to throw away the reasons for living, or something like that. And I think that's what we're doing. And that, weirdly enough, connects to love. I don't think we really believe in jeopardy and risk and death anymore. And I think if you're not willing to die for it, then maybe it's not romance. That probably sounds silly to some people. And maybe I've just
sounds a bit romantic.
Sounds a bit romantic, sure. Maybe I've read too many books. And maybe, who knows if I really believe it. I guess we'll see if ever I'm put to the test. We'll see if I do believe it. But I'd like to think I do. If there's your friend Camus, what did he say? The meaning of life is whatever's stopping you from killing yourself. Is that what Camus said?
Camus did say that.
At
least it's attributed to him. Sometimes that does happen, doesn't it?
Very often happens.
The meaning of life being literally whatever is stopping you from killing yourself.
My counterpoint, not in a literal sense, my take on that is the meaning of life is whatever you're willing to die for. And I think that applies in some strange way to love. Anyway, we're probably getting a little bit high in the clouds now with Socrates and all the rest.
I think what you're saying is true, and it can sound a bit lofty, but then romance is lofty.
Yeah.
I think when I was talking to Rabbi David Wolpe on the show, I think it was him who said something like the idea that like friendship is just injustice, like by definition. That's just like what friendship is.
Wow.
It's like being willing to basically unjustly prioritize the desires of one person over another. And I guess that's a form of sacrifice. In that case, you're sacrificing ethics. There's a sense in which you want to say if two people are drowning, there should be no reason to save one over the other because they're both equally valuable. But most people would save their friend over a stranger. And that makes sense to people. And I think a lot of people listening wouldn't even think that would be the wrong thing to do. But it does seem, in a sort of stripped back literal sense, unjust. And if you're Peter Singer, perhaps irrational. And maybe, that is kind of what love is and has to be. And then you've got to make a choice as to whether you want to throw yourself in with the romantics or with the people who will have stable lives and incomes and,
Sure. I think we should try and make a case for the fact that these aren't mutually exclusive. And I mean, love is a really interesting, I guess I didn't realize until not so many years ago how much love was discussed in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because and it probably shows, steered clear of philosophy as much as I can for most of my life. And it surprised me.
What is philosophy, Sheehan?
Fine, sure. Yeah, I mean, as in, capital F.
Love wisdom.
If you go to Foyle's and it's in the philosophy section, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay.
I guess. But yes, love of wisdom. But I didn't realize how much, like romantic love, the love of friendship, I didn't realize how much that stuff is discussed in both, I guess, in theology and philosophy. I've always approached it thinking, okay, for philosophy is about abstract concepts, theology is about God, and then art, that's where you find love, in paintings and music and literature and films. But it turns out philosophy, people talk about love constantly, right? And they're always trying to figure out what it is, what its role is, and so on and so forth.
It's the two places philosophy and theology go wrong. Philosophy goes wrong when it becomes so coldly analytical that it basically doesn't have any content anymore, and it's just a bunch of P's and Q's and symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And theology goes wrong when it forgets that the thing that's supposed to be under discussion, certainly in Christian theology, is God. And what is God? He is literally love itself. And so Christian theology, at least proper, is about love.
Mm-hmm.
And philosophy, maybe not so straightforwardly about love, but shouldn't abandon the personal Some people, swear by that and die on that hill. They say that, that's the reason analytic philosophy is invented, as a way to try to mathematize this quite sort of airy-fairy, all over the place philosophical idea.
Has it been good for the world?
There's no systematization of it. Has it been good for the world? Yes, but it might not have been good for the philosophers. Because it's really useful as a perspective. If you want to see, can this view be formalized and proven? And analytic philosophy is certainly useful in disproving ideas. If you formalize something and it's a contradiction, then you know it must be false. But there's a reason why, broadly speaking, people see two traditions of philosophy, and they see them as separate, the analytical and the so-called continental. And the continental strand is the narrative, the artsy, that contains something indispensable, such that it's not like philosophy just became analytical and improved in that sense, in the way that science mathematized. Science became something that started to be about maths and proof and systems. It didn't keep the prior stuff. Astronomy didn't branch off from astrology, and both are both considered sciences to the same degree by the academic discipline of a science department in a university. But in philosophy, they couldn't abandon that stuff. The mathematization and syllogization was not a development or an improvement. It was a detour or a nook to dive into. But it can never be philosophy in its totality. And that's what I think a lot of people are surprised, as you are, to realize when you look at philosophy and what people care about as a whole, it's got a lot more to do with that than
an awful lot about love, what it means and what exactly it is.
I think so. And like I say, it's easy to sort of wax lyrical, not only about how great love is, but also how the modern world has totally messed it up and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's sorry, Karen.
No, I just mean to say that I'm hoping that speaking with you like this, I think it's interesting. It's not just as simple as that,
Yeah, it's not as simple as and I it's important. It's so easy to take swings at the modernity. As I say, it's all people have ever done throughout history.
Yeah.
The one constant is that all they do is moan about how things are. And there was even this guy called William Harrison in the 1570s. He was part of this project to kind of write a history of the world, basically. But his job in this, a smaller job, which was just to write an account of contemporary England. So he just went around England looking at maps and speaking to people to create an account of contemporary life in Elizabethan England. And it's so interesting how much of this stuff sounds like it could have been written today. The most obvious example being he's talking to these old guys and they're just complaining about the fact that rent is going up year after year after year after year, and all the landlords, all they care about is wringing as much as they can out of these poor tenants. I mean, that was in the 1570s, and obviously you could be saying that now in 2025. So my point being, just taking swings at modernity is so easy. I don't think we're sitting here saying, well, we used to have it good, now we've messed it up, now it's crap. It's more like, okay, we know that there are things we're dissatisfied with, things that we're missing out on. Is there anything from the past that could help us figure out how to get to that thing? It's not about good versus bad. It's not about better versus worse. It's just about whether or not the past can help us find a better route through the thorny future that we kind of see dimly ahead of us.
And for me, it is probably this implicit assumption in the history of romantic thought that love is supposed to be sometimes a bit foolish. It's supposed to rub against the grain. It's supposed to be something irrational.
I think that's what we need. Are you saying that's what we need now?
I think probably, or at least a recognition of that. It might still not be a risk you think is worth taking, but it's worth reminding yourself that if that's what you do want, if love is what you're after, that's probably where you're going to find it.
I think so. I would agree. I think that is something that we can point to and say, look, the modern world needs a bit of that, because it is becoming increasingly stale. But I mean, I've got to say, in recent months, the world has become a bit more interesting. And I do sometimes wonder if all the political developments of recent times are a product of boredom on the part of people who are just in a kind of in a state of life that's just far too advanced. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. But yeah, I think now things are, notwithstanding the political stuff, day to day, it's convenient. It's ever more convenient, but it's boring. Like, who likes getting Deliveroo? like, you know, like he was like, oh man, I live in 2025. I can just get freaking burritos delivered to my door.
It's
whenever
cool
I
when you
want.
think about it. It's cool to
If we sit down,
say, but isn't it awesome that we
you
can
don't
do
that,
that?
right? Like, I don't think anyone likes this convenient life we're living. I mean, if you deprived us of these conveniences, maybe we'd appreciate them more. But I don't even know if that's true. Like, if you force someone to live without a car for a year, they'd probably get used to it and think, you know what? Why the hell did I? It's like quitting smoking, right? Like, or drinking. These things, when you're doing them, are great, and it's hard to stop. But when you manage to do it, you're like, actually, why? What if you can manage to do it? You think, why did I ever do that in the first place? I didn't need it.
The problem is with stuff like the car or social media, or whatever. It's not just you that needs to stop. It's society.
It's society.
You need to get everyone else to stop, and that's the problem too. When you said earlier that you can just you can just not use Tinder. It's like, it's not just the effect that something like Tinder would have on you. It's the effect that Tinder has on everybody. You can be the person who doesn't use dating apps, and you walk into the bar, but everyone's mindset about dating has
been already reshaped,
has shifted and been reshaped.
Well,
Same thing with pornography. It totally,
you're right.
It doesn't. Right. You can give up pornography and you can reorient yourself to true romance, but the people that you're surrounded by might not have managed to do that, and so it's a little bit harder in that regard. Which is why I think it's something we need to remember on a more.
No, I was literally just thinking as you were talking that we
level.
have been kind of in the as I said, in the clouds a little bit, and if anybody is listening, what might interest them more than anything is, okay, that's all well and good. Like, we're convinced that romance is beautiful and worth pursuing. We're like, fine, then how the hell do you do it in 2025? Sure, but I think, there's so much to unpack there. The first thing though is there is hope, right? We aren't living in this sort of end game where everyone is in the Matrix. It hasn't happened yet. Like, plenty of people either don't use dating apps or use them a little bit and use them and are still fine. It's not like if you use them once, your just brain is poisoned forever. It's very easy to be hyperbolic about this stuff. I think it's funny, literally, it's actually almost the opposite is true, that things are actually pretty good, and it's just that little 0.5% of opening your eyes a little bit wider or looking in a slightly different place. Suddenly it's like, actually everything's great. And I think there are plenty of people out there who you could, let's say, meet who haven't been sort of had their brains and hearts and souls completely eviscerated by the modern world. I think there are very few people, if anybody, who's reached that level of sort of spiritual and emotional and psychological degradation.
It's not as bad as it seems. Maybe the motif of history is it's always better than it was before, but always feels like it's probably worse.
Yeah,
and would have been better in the past.
Always. Without like golden ages are always in the past, aren't they?
Yes, and people forget about the smell.
People forget about bloody hell they do.
Yeah.
Looking to the future, I guess, I don't know, maybe one day we will just have to ban the internet. I don't know. Like, it sounds crazy, but stranger things have happened, right? We're slowly but surely winning the war on smoking, as vaping has appeared, but when it comes to something like the internet and social media and dating apps, like, we suffer from them now, but in 50 years, that's a long time. These things can go when society...
I think banning pornography is probably the more practical step.
Sure. No, I agree. Banning the internet was a little bit... That's
a complicated matter because, like, a lot of people want to claim a sort of performative free speech when it comes to pornography. That might be legally difficult, but certainly the idea of regulating it, not just the industry of production, but consumption to the extent that no child should ever be watching it. You know?
Absolutely, without doubt. But I think to maybe, I guess, come full circle, although there are broader social changes that need to take place.
And we force kids to read Dante as well.
Exactly. Well, yeah. Well, the thing is, then when you force someone to read it, it's not as good. You've got to kind of come across it by choice, right? You've got to stumble upon Dante and fall in love with him. Yeah. But the point being that despite these broader social changes that may need to happen to reach this utopia that we'll never reach, that crap almost doesn't matter. Like, when does society ever change in ways that we really want it to without further repercussions that we didn't foresee? That's just, we can go on forever. But in your life, day to day, year by year, month by month, minute by minute, there are small things that you can do to I think, to embrace a slightly different way of living. And one of them could be not using dating apps, a little bit boring. One of them might be reading Dante. Okay, that's quite exciting. One of them, might be learning just to bloody look up every once in a while and look at the sky and think, bloody hell, the sky is blue. Like, that's just... How is this? It's just, it almost makes me want to cry. It's miraculous. There's a blue sky out there. It's blue. There's a big blue thing up there, and you learn to embrace these little wonders. And suddenly, life, despite everything else, isn't so bad. And you don't need to rely on politicians to do it for you, and nor do you need to rely on podcasters or pseudo intellectuals like you or me. You can just go out and There's plenty of beauty and love in the flowers and the trees. God, that sounds a little bit wishy-washy, but it's true. There's a reason we've been saying it for all of history. Anyway.
There's a reason so much poetry has been dedicated to that cause.
Yeah. And it's always timeless. That's the other thing. It's always timeless. Read a poem from however long ago. If it's not about society, if it's about nature or about love, it's timeless. Immediately timeless. So you can understand, notwithstanding the language barrier, there's no context. There's nothing you need to learn. You can just if I gave you Dante's love poetry now, you wouldn't need to know anything about the politics of 13th century Italy. You would just get it, right? So, whereas it's funny, then think about the podcast we're all doing now, the manosphere stuff. In 100 years, it will probably be it'll be gibberish because so much of it is fine-tuned towards the society we're living in now.
True.
Which isn't that's fair enough, right? That's why it works. But it's an interesting metric for looking at stuff. Like, will it make sense to people 500 years from now or 100 years from now? If it doesn't, then maybe it's not as worth your time as it seems.
Yeah.
There we go.
Might even be gibberish right now. That remains to be seen. Sheehan Quirk, thanks for coming back on.
Alex O'Connor, always a pleasure. And of course, do consider buying my book.
Oh yeah, the book. Bloody hell.
Book,
it's in the description.
It's in the description.
I've written it.
Against all odds, I've written a book.
Let's not milk it. They know that it's down there.
Okay.
You co-authored a book with Joan Taylor called Women Remembered, about the early female followers of Jesus of Nazareth. Women Remembered as a project implies women forgotten. So my question is this, to start with. Jesus famously had 12 followers, and they're named in the Gospels, although it's not always exactly clear if those names were decided upon by the Gospel authors. But one thing that we're pretty sure about is that they were all men. And throughout the history of Christianity, people have looked at this and thought Jesus chose only male followers, and that gives us some indication of how we should treat gender relations within the church. Why were all of Jesus's principal 12 followers men?
I think it depends what the purpose of these 12 people were. So Jesus, yes, you're right. There's a clear memory that Jesus had 12 male disciples, though, as you say, the exact makeup of who was included in the group is a bit uncertain in some of the lists. But the important thing is that everyone remembered that there were 12 of them, even if they didn't remember exactly who made up that 12. The important thing about 12, when you look at sort of Jewish history, is that 12 is a number of the tribes of Israel. And I think an important thing about what Jesus is doing is preaching about the restoration of Israel. So originally there were 12 tribes. By the time of Jesus, though, there's only 2 tribes left. The others have been swept away by the Assyrian invasion. And so I think part of this is the symbolic value of Jesus sort of saying, open your hearts, come back to God, and there will be a 12ness again. There will be 12 tribes. And so I think what these 12 male disciples are doing is harking back to this time when you have, Israel as a whole. It's reconstituted Israel. And that's a completely separate thing from who was a disciple, who followed him. And it's very clear from the Gospels, actually, that there were women following him too, even if sometimes they're a bit slow to tell us. So in Mark's Gospel, for example, which most people think is the earliest Gospel, it's right at the end, by the time you get to the crucifixion, that Mark suddenly says, oh, and, there were a few women too, and many women, actually, he says, and they had followed him from Galilee. So actually, they've been on the road with him all this time. So this mental picture we often have that's reinforced by films and documentaries of Jesus striding out across the country with 12 strapping lads with him really does need to be kind of changed a little bit to include these women as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating how even some of the more iconic women within the sort of Jesus ministry, many people will be familiar with certain names. Mary Magdalene is perhaps the most famous, except for maybe the Mary, the mother of Jesus. And reading Mark's Gospel, as you say, the earliest Gospel, it might strike you when you get to very near the end, and it's the crucifixion. This is in Mark chapter 15, all the way down in verse 40. We finally see, after Jesus dies, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, the younger of Joseph, and Salome. And this is the first mention of Mary Magdalene. And I think people reading Mark's Gospel think to themselves, oh God, I totally forgot about her. And then they're like, wait, hold on, is this it? Is this really all we get? It's really interesting how a lot of noise is made, particularly by like Christian apologists, about the importance of the women discovering the empty tomb. It is, of course, the women who find the tomb empty on Easter morning. And yet, it's like they only show up there where they're narratively necessary. And yet we're told, like you say, that these were women who had been following Jesus for some time. And there's even an indication that they were doing more than just following Jesus, but also kind of helping out a little bit in terms of funding the ministry, right?
Yeah, and this comes from Luke. So what you've been describing so far is Mark's gospel, where the women suddenly appear at the end. In Luke's gospel, though, and Luke is rewriting Mark is his major source. So Luke actually moves these women much earlier. He has them in chapter 8 already. So if you're reading Luke's gospel, you do have this different mental picture. You've got the 12 male, and he says, and there were many women too. But the interesting thing, as you say, about Luke, well, a couple of interesting things. One is that he changes the women. Mary Magdalene is common to both lists, but he has different women. He mentions Joanna, the wife of Chusa, who's only found in Luke's gospel. But he also adds a line to say that the women were paying for either them or him out of their own resources, or they were ministering to them out of their own resources, is the exact Greek. So, of course, people have, asked, what does this mean? What does ministering to them out of their own resources imply? And it does seem to be something financial. So Luke does seem to be suggesting that these women are women of a certain wealth. They're well-to-do women who are somehow bankrolling this movement. I mean, of course, that then raises the question, is that historically likely or not? Does Jesus have a load of wealthy women in tow with him? And some have said, yeah, well, why not? Maybe they're older, maybe they've sort of inherited, maybe they're wealthy widows. Another possibility, though, is that Luke is very keen all the way through both the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, which is probably the second sort of volume of the Gospel of Luke. He's very keen throughout all of that to suggest that Christianity, whilst it sort of attracts women, only attracts women of a certain type. So it's elite women, it's respectable women, it's wealthy women. And so it would sort of fit Luke's purposes to sort of imply that these were well-to-do women. They're not, they're not rough fisher women. They're not kind of poor beggar women. They're elite, well-to-do women. So that does put some queries over certainly that aspect of what Luke is saying.
Right. And also, as you say, Luke changes the women, or perhaps includes a different set of women, one of whom is Joanna, the wife of Chusa. And it's specified that Chusa, the husband of Joanna, is a steward to Herod Antipas, who will be the king of Judea at the time. So an incredibly powerful man. So a steward to Herod has a wife called Joanna, and that wife is one of the women who is potentially bankrolling Jesus' ministry. So we have this further indication that at least one of these women might have come from the court of Herod in some or to some degree, which would mean that she probably had a bit of money under her belt. And although they were just sort of wandering around in the desert, they will have had to find some kind of way of sustaining themselves. It's not all sort of miraculous bread from heaven after all. And so it's an interesting indication, but the thing that strikes most readers is that it's so sparse. It's like you get this very, very brief mention. As with so much of biblical scholarship, you get a tiny little line in Greek, and you have to sort of get everything you can out of that. And reading your book, Women Remembered, which you co-authored with Joe, and I mentioned that and I'll put that in the description. One of the things that struck me was just how much you were able to pull out of some quite sort of quite short, quite sparse references to the various women in the New Testament. And it doesn't feel like sort of stretching. It doesn't feel like pulling out more than you should in the way that, people parody English teachers for doing in every single line of a poem or something, and really reading into it. It really seems like there's a lot that we can know about these women. So of the most important women in the New Testament, who do you think we can know the most about? Because I think it'd be interesting to start there and talk about like who we can actually really get a grip on.
Well, thank you for saying that it doesn't sound stretched. I mean, both of us have spent a lot of time looking at first century Judea, not just the women, but the archaeology and the history and everything connected with that. So hopefully, even when we're sort of filling in gaps, we have a pretty good idea of what was likely and what was unlikely in that period. And yes, I mean that is a tantalizing thing. We get Joanna, the wife of Chusa, is so interesting because almost every word in that description is really, really interesting. I mean, who was the manager of Herod Antipas's estates? I mean, that's really exciting in itself. But we know so little about some of these women. Sometimes it's just a name, Salome. Who's she? But people clearly knew who she was because she's not described as the wife of someone or the daughter or, oh, Salome. Yeah, Salome. We know who she is. But I think the person we know most about, the woman we know most about, is probably Mary Magdalene, despite the fact that, as you rightly say, you can look through the whole Gospels and you're not finding all these references to her being a prostitute or all of the things that have been added to besmirch her over the years. She really does appear at the end, and her role is very much to be sort of the witness to the cross and then to the empty tomb later on. But I think even though there's a literary relationship between the Gospels, the fact that all of them, even when they change the names of women, always include Mary Magdalene does suggest that there's something sort of preeminent about her. When it comes to sort of female disciples, Mary Magdalene is always the one that you mention. And I think it does make sense to see her in some way as an authority figure or a sort of a leader of a group of women, women disciples who then become women missionaries. And when you think about the situation at the time, it is a deeply patriarchal society, and women wouldn't have simply been able to go up to Peter, or Peter couldn't have just gone to a group of women, for example, washing clothes and say, let me baptize you. That would have really been quite scandalous. You would have needed a chaperone. You couldn't have been alone with a man. And I think to get the message out to women, you needed women to act as intermediaries. And so I think in the same way that you have this sort of the mission to other people, to largely men in the Gospels, you've also got this sort of equal and opposite sort of mission to women. And I think probably Mary Magdalene was the equivalent to Peter in that.
There's a lot to say about Mary Magdalene, of course. You've already mentioned the idea that she's a prostitute who is repentant, who, may or may not have had some kind of romantic interest or relationship with Jesus, depending on which musical you watch or which apocryphal gospel you read. But before talking about Mary Magdalene, who I think most people will be interested in hearing about, you talked about this idea just then of Jesus sending out his disciples. And this hadn't crossed my mind until I saw the documentary that you and Dr. Taylor made on this same subject material, which I'll also link in the description, because that's a great watch too. And just thinking about it, they're going out and they're converting people to Christianity. And what are they doing? They're anointing people with oils and they're baptizing people, like immersion in water, which is probably not done like totally fully clothed, or if so, would be quite a sort of intimate thing to do with someone that you didn't really know.
Very intimate.
And especially given, like you say, the cultural circumstances, it's difficult to imagine Peter and Paul walking into a room full of women and saying, right, ladies, let's all jump in the river together. And so just on an intuitive level, you think there must have been some women involved. But there is also this textual indication, which is that if you look at Mark chapter 6, when Jesus sends out the 12 to minister the word and spread it as far and wide as they can, he calls the 12 to himself and begins to send them out, in the Greek, duo. That is 2 by 2. He sends them out 2 by 2. And there's an interesting implication about the usage of this term, because that duo, 2 by 2, also shows up in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, when Noah is bringing the animals on board the ark. So what might this tell us about what's going on here?
Yeah, well, this is one of the great ideas of Joan Taylor, who I wrote the book with, as you've mentioned, and she spotted that too. That it's normally assumed that when Jesus is sending out the the 12 male disciples, 2 by 2, that just means, 6 groups of 2 male disciples. But because of this link with the Noah story, 2 by 2, where the animals are always, they're a gendered pair, she suggested that each of these male disciples is sort of buddying up with a female disciple too, and that they are going out as a male and female. And what's particularly interesting about that too, I think, is that very quickly we see this as the standard pattern of ministry within the early church. So already in Paul's letters and Acts, the idea that you have missionary pairs, and sometimes they're married, but sometimes they're not necessarily married. They're, what they call a sister wife. They're 2 missionaries who go out together. And there's obvious advantages of that, as we've already said, because of the cultural setting. It enables a missionary pair to go into a house or a town or a village and to sort of divide up their energies. And if we're right that 2 by 2 does hark back to the Noah story and does imply that it's a gendered pair, then that whole sort of method of ministry then goes right back to the time of Jesus.
Yeah, that's interesting too. It's not just this callback to the 2 by 2 of Noah, but also the fact that in the letters of Paul, in Acts, we see these male-female pairs. So like in Romans 16, where we meet Junior and Andronicus, I think is how you say his name, as this pair. That is indeed if Junius is a woman. We'll get on to that in due course.
And Prisca and Aquila and Clopas and another disciple. So all the way through, once you start looking for these kind of gendered pairs, they do seem to be everywhere.
Yeah, and so it's not, and again, this is on the more speculative side, but it's not out of the question that when Jesus sends out the 12 disciples 2 by 2, he's sending them out with their sister wives or perhaps their real life partners. So there's some indication on an intuitive level and maybe on a textual level that women are more involved here than they're first given credit for. But yeah, let's talk about Mary Magdalene. So when people are named in the Bible, it's important to realize that second names weren't really a thing in the same way that they are today. Instead, these second names might be thought of as what we could call a disambiguator, because there were so many people with the same name that it was ambiguous who you were talking about. Mary was the most common name in the ancient world in this area. And so there would need to be some distinction. That's why it's not just Mary, it's Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's Mary, the mother of James. It's Mary, the son of this person. Mary, the wife of this person. So the disambiguator for this Mary is Mary Magdalene. Is Magdalene like the name of her husband or something?
Well, no, this is also really interesting, and this again is largely Joan's idea, so I can't claim any credit here. But I think what's really interesting about Mary Magdalene is that she's not known as the daughter of, the wife of. There is no male associated with her at all. The standard interpretation of Hey Magdalene, which is what it says in the Greek, is that it means Mary from Magdala. And Magdala is thought to be a place that's identical with with a place called Tarichaea in the Greek, which is a sort of thriving fishing town on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. In fact, I mean, you can go to Magdala today and see all these excavations, and there's all kinds of stuff happening there. They've unearthed synagogues and a really interesting altar stone and all kinds of things like that. The difficulty, though, is that the word Magdala just means, or Migdal means a tower in Aramaic, and there's lots and lots of towers in Israel. Often they're associated with fishing, so they're by the sea, and obviously somebody goes up the tower and looks for shoals of fish. So Magdala on its own isn't much of a descriptor. It just means the tower, and so a lot of places are called Migdal something. So it's possible that Migdal is another name for Tarichaea, as the traditional view says, but it's also possible that Mary the Magdalene actually has nothing to do with her place, but is to do with a nickname And we certainly know that Jesus liked to give people nicknames. Simon is called Peter, which we're told means the rock. There's James and John are called the sons of thunder, Boanerges. So it's not impossible that Jesus also gave Mary a nickname. And going back to this meaning of Migdal in Aramaic, meaning a tower, this would then mean something like, tower woman, tower lady. And maybe it's because she's a tower of strength, a beacon of faith, or maybe there's a kind of a double entendre here. Maybe she does come from a place called Migdal something. And, Jesus is kind of playing on this in terms of giving her this nickname. But I think that, again, would tend to underline the idea that she is something special. She's picked out to be the leader of this mission to women.
Yeah, the thing that's really interesting to me there is the commonality of Jesus giving nicknames to people and the importance of these nicknames, and the fact that, is it a coincidence that the most important female follower of Jesus might be called something like the Tower? Like the theological implications of that are huge. And especially given that it is the use of the definitive article that really gets me going. It's Mary the Magdalene, And I suppose
Exactly.
that could mean like Mary of Magdalene as well, but like the word is the definitive article, right? It's whenever
Yes,
she's
it
mentioned,
is.
it's Mary the Magdalene.
There are cases of that being used, of people coming from a particular area. So it's not unknown. But in other cases, so Joseph of Arimathea, for example, it uses the preposition apo, so Joseph from Arimathea. So there's no doubt about that. But you can use the definite article to mean, in the same way that you might talk about Jesus the Nazarene, meaning he comes from Nazareth. You could use, so there is an ambiguity there, but it's equally possible. And I think given the fact that there doesn't seem to be an obvious place called Magdala, despite the modern excavations in Tarichaea, I think it's a very interesting idea that Mary has been given this honorific title. Really, it's a nickname, but it's also putting her on a bit of a pedestal, I would imagine. Like you say, to say she's a tower, it implies strength, it implies faith, it implies someone you can rely on, someone who's going to do what you ask them to do. So all good things, really.
Yeah, so many of these names are mystifying. I often think of Thomas, also called Didymus, which means the twin.
Yeah.
And why on earth?
Twin of who?
not only why Thomas is known as the twin, but why the gospel authors thought it so important to let us know that he was called the twin. And there might be something like this going on too with Mary the Magdalene, because perhaps like it gets to the end of the gospel account, and the author of Mark's gospel is like, right, we need Mary. Oh, you should know, this was Mary the Tower. Like she wasn't just anybody. She's the person who discovered Jesus, or discovered the empty tomb. However, one thing we do know about Mary Magdalene, if we are to believe the artistic media that has surrounded her in recent decades, is that she was a repentant prostitute, that she was sexually immoral. Jesus came and sent these demons of prostitution out of her, and now she's repentant and possibly even in a romantic relationship with Jesus himself. What does the media depiction, or the sort of popular culture depiction of Mary Magdalene, get wrong, or at least present that doesn't have any biblical justification?
Well, pretty much everything that you just said is wrong, really. The idea that she's a repentant prostitute just is not there. And it goes back to this idea that there are so many Marys. As you said, Mary and Salome are the most common names in the first century. Something like a third of women were called one or other of those names. So if you shout Mary, half of the room kind of turns round. So, and that's reflected in the Gospels too. There are lots of Marys. And what's happening with Mary Magdalene is that she gets conflated with other Marys. So she gets mixed up with Mary and Martha, who in John's Gospel, it's Mary who who anoints Jesus's is it feet? Yeah, Jesus's feet in that gospel. And then that gets sort of mixed up with the anointing woman in Luke's gospel, who is specifically said to be a sinful woman from the city. So what else could she be apart from a prostitute? And so that's kind of mixed up. And sometimes, ideas of the woman caught in adultery and all of these women sort of somehow swarm together to produce this composite picture. And this goes back to the very early church, actually. They started sort of conflating these Marys, but it's particularly linked with Pope Gregory the Great in the early 6th century, who very much kind of used this composite Mary as a symbol of penitence. And in that guise, she was a very useful symbol for the church. She was this fallen woman who repented, and, we should all take inspiration from Mary. But I mean, in terms of this being anything like the historical Mary Magdalene, or even the Mary Magdalene we get in the Gospels, it's a far cry. But of course, Christian art over the centuries has really sort of doubled down on this picture, and lots of artistic representation. Mary's kind of like this belly dancer character with veils and cold eyes and all the rest of it. I mean, in recent years, we have had this change in direction with the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code Mary Magdalene, and suddenly now she's no longer the prostitute, but she's the sort of the love interest. She's there with the boys. She's sleeping with the boss, and I'm not sure that that's any better from a feminist point of view. She's only there because of her relationship to Jesus, but it is at least a different picture, and she's sort of given this privileged position. So she's the one woman who's sort of allowed in on the boys' games, but without the other women that the Gospels clearly mention are there too. So I don't know. It's an interesting thing, and I think these representations kind of reflect society's difficulties with women in leadership positions. And it's amazing, I think, how far behind the rest of society our picture of Mary Magdalene is. We've got to the idea, this sort of this Maid Marian idea that she can be there because of her relationship to the boss, but we're not quite there yet in terms of saying she's actually just there because she's good at her job and she's got a lot of women who are following her direction and going out and being very effective missionaries.
Yeah. And she is quite important. As we've already mentioned, whenever she does show up in these lists of names, which sometimes change the women mentioned, she's always there. She's always mentioned first as well.
Yep,
yeah,
exactly.
Like she's the important one, or the one that people will have heard of or be familiar with, perhaps. But as we've said, she shows up at the crucifixion of Jesus and also at the tomb, but there are other women there too, right? And so we have these other names that do crop up. You've already said that the second most common name in the ancient world was Salome for women. There is a follower of Jesus called Salome, who was also one of the women who discovered this empty tomb. What can we know about Salome? She's another person that you have a chapter on in this book. But again, it's quite scant, right? So who is this Salome person?
I wish we knew. Yeah, I mean, we have almost nothing about her. She's just called Salome, and people seem to know who she is. She's not the mother of, she's not the wife of, she's just Salome. In some traditions, she's Jesus's sister. So
Right.
There is a tradition that Jesus has a sister called Salome. And I wouldn't necessarily kind of, dismiss that. I think a lot of these women were probably related to the 12 male disciples. They may well have been recruited from these sort of fishing villages that Jesus spends a lot of time amongst. So it's not impossible she's a relative, but we just don't know. I mean, she could equally be a wife of one of the other disciples. We don't know anything more about her, unfortunately, other than that she's there. She travels on the road with Jesus. She's there at the cross, the empty tomb, and she's one of these very first witnesses to the resurrection.
One interesting thing that I wanted to ask you about and see what you think about this. and you mention it in the book as well, is that when Salome is mentioned, for example, so she first shows up in Mark chapter 15. We've already talked about this verse, where suddenly we're told some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. It seems to me that although this naturally reads as 1, Mary Magdalene, 2, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, 3, and Salome, isn't there like some ambiguity here? Like it could, for example, the text could mean to say, because there are no commas here, like there are in the English, it could mean to say, among them were 1, Mary Magdalene, and 2, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome, as if to say that this second Mary was the mother of Salome as well.
Mm-hmm. That's possible, yeah, and there's big discussions of how many women there are at the cross in all the Gospels. I mean, John's Gospel is particularly problematic, whether there are 3 or 4. I suppose the difficulty is that you wouldn't normally say somebody is the mother of a woman, though obviously you could if the woman was very well known, as in this case, perhaps. I mean, she does appear later on. There's the sort of 3 mentions of these women. I think in one of them Salome isn't mentioned, but I think when you look at all of them together, it does suggest that there's 3 women. But you're absolutely right. It is very without commas and without anything else. It is difficult to know exactly how many women we're dealing with here. There's also the added complication that some people suggest that Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, could be Jesus's mother, because those are the names of 2 of Jesus's brothers. And if you lumped Salome in with that, then that could also be Jesus's sister, if that tradition is correct. But that just seems odd to me. I think if Jesus' mother was there, they would have said, his mother. They wouldn't have gone in this roundabout way and picked out 2 sort of random brothers and said, the mother of these 2. I think the reason people like that interpretation is that it then sort of harmonizes with John's Gospel, which does have the mother of Jesus at the cross. I think Mark's Gospel and the Synoptic Gospels generally don't.
Yes, we've got at the cross here in Mark's Gospel, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. One interesting feature is that in Matthew's Gospel, and of course Matthew is using Mark as a source, Matthew also lists 3 women and says many women were there watching from a distance. They'd followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Which is another sort of clunky way of saying it, I suppose. But interestingly, Mark's Gospel has 3 names. Matthew's has the same, except that last name, Salome, is now rendered as an anonymous mother of Zebedee's sons. So again, a lot of exegetes look at this and say, well, that's because Matthew knew that Salome was the mother of Zebedee's sons. That is, like the apostles of Jesus who are Zebedee's sons. So we've also got this indication that Salome might have been like Zebedee's wife, I suppose.
Yeah, that is another possibility, and one that the commentaries take seriously. I mean, another sort of slight problem with that is that Matthew has already created a character around Zebedee's wife. So in Mark's Gospel, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, come to Jesus with this really embarrassing question. They say, when you come in glory, can we sit on the left and right? And Jesus says, oh, guys, you really don't understand. And so in Matthew's Gospel, when you get to that, Matthew's clearly a little bit uncomfortable with the disciples really not getting it. So he says that it was their mum who went and asked Jesus, can my boys have the best seats? And so, that gets over that sort of problematic thing about the boys not really getting it. So he has already made her into a character. So it's possible on one level that he has better historical information, or he just sort of knows something here, but equally possible that he just doesn't know who Salome is. And because he's already created this character around the wife of Zebedee, maybe he just kind of adds her for that reason. It's so difficult to know with these random names. It's like the Simon of Cyrene in Mark 15, where in Mark's gospel he says Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Who are these guys? Why put them in?
Yeah.
Unless perhaps, people in the audience know them. I mean, that's the obvious thing, isn't it? Oh, remember Alexander and Rufus? This is their dad. So again, it's not unreasonable to think that the evangelists change the women according to just women that they know, particularly when Mark says there were many women. So there's maybe a lot to choose from. You put in the ones that you are aware of, or that you know some traditions about. Your group kind of has some affinity with this particular woman. It's hard to know.
And it is important to point out that, like, a lot of people will say, for example, the Gospels contradict each other because is it, one woman or two women or three women, and which women are they? And we know for a fact, because Mary Magdalene, for example, only shows up in Mark 15, and we're told retrospectively, oh, by the way, she was like with Jesus the whole time. We just didn't mention her. We know that the Gospel authors didn't exhaustively list everyone who was present, and oftentimes only mentioned the people who were specifically relevant to what they were talking about. And so it's impossible to know the number of women that we're talking about here. One tiny other indication of this Salome as not a third name in the list, but also one of the daughters, is that when Jesus rises, when they discover the empty tomb, Mark's gospel says in Mark chapter 16 that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices to anoint Jesus' body. So it seems like three women there. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. But it could read as Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Be a little bit clunky, but it is interesting how, when you get to Matthew's gospel, the same story is reported, and Matthew just has two women, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. So if this second Mary really was the mother of James and Salome, as if to say the mother of James and the mother of Salome, there's some indication here from the fact that Matthew interprets this or rewords this part of the story as just saying Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. However, it is important to point out that maybe he just didn't mention Salome. Maybe he didn't think she was relevant.
Or maybe he's just getting a bit confused with all these.
It's also true with all these women.
And he's not too bothered. Maybe by the time he's writing, these women are largely forgotten already in these communities, these sort of reading groups that he's writing for, and he just sort of says, and a Mary. There's always a Mary. It's always hard to know whether you're reading too much into things. How deliberate are some of these changes? I mean, because they're fascinating, and often you can sort of run with changes and you see the same type of changes being made, and I think that's often a good indication that you're onto something. But when you've only really got one or two things, it's difficult to know. Did he just write it because he just thought, oh, that doesn't really matter much?
Yeah, it does seem like women show up in the New Testament narratives only when they are strictly necessary to the story. It's like we can't help but bring them up.
Yeah.
And the sort of corollary of that is to think that there are instances where the women were present and perhaps doing something that was important, but were just not told about it because of a sort of narrative erasure. One indication of this, for example, is the fact that, as we've already discussed at length, the women were crucial to the discovery of the empty tomb. Mary Magdalene is said in John's Gospel to be the first person who sees the risen Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in some detail, and these traditions of Jesus appearing to the women and the women running and telling the men, and of course the male disciples don't believe them and have to go and check for themselves. But one interesting feature is that if you look at Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which is one of the most, it's definitely an authentic Pauline letter. It's one of our earliest New Testament sources. It's written before the Gospels. In chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, Paul famously lists off this sort of schema, these people that Jesus appeared to. He says, for what I have received, I pass on to you of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me. Well, hold on a second. He's just listed a bunch of names in trying to sort of celebrate how wonderful it is that Jesus has appeared to all of these people, and neglected to mention who our gospel narratives tell us are some of the most important early first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. Why wouldn't Paul mention that?
It's bad. I mean, there are various reasons, and this is, one of those huge intractable problems. Why does Paul not mention the women? I mean, one common suggestion actually is that he doesn't mention the women simply because this story has not yet been made up.
Right,
Paul is writing in the 50s. The earliest gospel is Mark's gospel, probably early 70s or so. Mark just doesn't know about this tradition. Paul just doesn't know about this tradition. I mean, that's possible. And I think there's probably something to that. But I think, stories about, if there was an empty tomb at all, then stories about it must have been sort of, known to people. I mean, for Paul, it's all about visions, who has seen the resurrected Jesus? And he doesn't mention an empty tomb at all. He doesn't seem interested in that. And so what some people say is that the whole empty tomb tradition is a later invention designed to kind of give the resurrected Jesus more of a bodily raising, to really graphically underline the fact that he has been raised from the dead because the tomb is empty, his body is no longer there. And so the argument goes, Paul doesn't really buy into that whole thing. He's just thinking, who has actually had a vision of the of that raised Jesus? So I suppose the question is, where does the whole story about resurrection come from in the first place? Is it simply a question of people seeing visions and being convinced in some way that that Jesus is alive again? Is there an element of people going to the tomb and finding it empty, or not being able to find the tomb, or being a bit confused about where the tomb is? I mean, Mark is making a lot of effort here to say that women who knew Jesus saw him die, and they saw where the tomb was, and they came back to the same place later on. He's really trying to emphasize that. And that does make me think that there must have been people around who say, yes, but nobody knows, nobody knew where Jesus was buried. Nobody, he was buried by people who weren't followers. The whole thing was just, nobody had any facts and any information. So he's very clear to make this link. I think for Paul, he's just not interested in any of this. He's just talking about people who've seen resurrection appearances. But I think it's also significant that the women make their first appearance in Mark's gospel. And one of the things about Mark is that he doesn't have any appearances, and he ends on this very uncertain note. So, he has the women run away. They've seen this angel who says, he's not here. He's been raised, and the women are seized with fear and run off. And so that's a very strange place to leave your gospel. There's no tidy endings. There's no visions. There's no hurrah, he's raised from the dead. Instead, it's this strange story of women going down to the grave, finding it empty, and not being sure about what to do about it. And so I think if anybody is going to pass on traditions about women finding sort of graves and not knowing what to do about it, it's going to be Mark, because that's the kind of ending he wants. He wants this ambiguous ending, and you have to then kind of supply your own faith. And then, of course, that gets retold in all the other Gospels because they're retellings of Mark. Whereas I think Paul's project is just very different. Even if he did know that women went down to the tomb and they couldn't find the tomb, or they found it empty, or there was just some uncertainty about where Jesus's remains were, he's not going to tell you that, because in that passage in 1 Corinthians 15, it's almost like a sort of a creedal, sort of going back to, this is our founding story. These people, these important people, Peter and the 12 and Jesus's brother, 500 brethren, and last of all, Paul. So it's people whose word can be trusted. And he's wanting to nail it down. He's not wanting to leave you with a certain ambiguity like Mark is. So I think you can sort of work out reasons why Paul may not have mentioned the women, even if he had heard that there were stories about women going to the tomb and not being sure about what they were finding.
Well, one option is also that Paul was a sexist, although maybe we can talk about that a bit too. But even if Paul himself is not a sexist, given the culture that he was writing in, if for Paul the importance was telling the message of Jesus, he might have thought to himself, well, if I tell everyone that it was women who discovered the tomb, they might not, so let's just not mention that because they might not trust the women. Whereas
You're absolutely
the
right.
gospel authors, unavoidably, they have to mention the women because everybody knew it was women who discovered the empty tomb. So it's possible that Paul left it out not because of his own sexism, but because he realized it wouldn't sort of work in the project that he was trying to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's undoubtedly right. It would have added nothing to his sort of great sort of story of the resurrection and people seeing visions to say, well, some women went down and they couldn't find the body. That's nothing about that account is going to be useful for him. And this is a society where the voices of women were not necessarily trusted in a court of law. So there's nothing kind of adding to his argument to say that we can trust these women. I think he's sexist in the same way that everybody in that culture was sexist to a degree. It's the men's voices that you want to trust here.
Yes, don't we have so I can't remember when it's from, but somebody writing about trying to dismiss Christianity as sort of the tomb was discovered by these delirious women or something.
Yeah.
What am I thinking?
Yeah, it's Celsus, 2nd century pagan philosopher, who's actually very, very up on the Gospels and sort of goes through the Gospels and critiques them. And one of his many critiques is that the empty tomb was discovered by, as you say, a delirious woman. And he constantly says that Christianity is full of the worst type of beggar women, uneducated people and women, and that's very much a sign for him that this is a degenerate movement that really has no place and shouldn't be trusted.
Yeah, which gives you an indication as to the psychology of the people Paul was writing to and why he might have been hesitant to mention the women.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, I mean, I think, again, with the Gospels, why they perhaps wouldn't overemphasize the role of women in this story. I mean, partly I think they're telling a story of the Jesus movement, and then as you get into Acts, it's the spread of the movement across the Roman world, and they're very much shining the light on what the men are doing, because that's what feels natural to them, as it would have done to most authors up to about the last few decades. But at the same time, I think they probably realized subconsciously, if not consciously, that including too many women in this was not a good idea, because most people in the Roman world would have thought that a new religious movement that had too many women in it was not a good thing.
Yes, although, regardless of what somebody wants to say, we do have some indications of the presence of women in the early church, even though they're not really mentioned in the Gospels in some sense. When we turn to Paul, who is famously the problem for women in Christianity, because he's the one that says women should be silent in churches, that Adam was formed first, then Eve. He's the one that basically brings all of the sexism to Christianity. It's also in Paul's letter to the Romans that we find a strong indication of the reverence which he had for at least some women. So I want to sort of put a pin in the sexism stuff, because we've been talking about a video that I'm hoping to produce soon about these sexist verses in Paul, and my ultimate analysis of most of these really hard-hitting cases is that Paul didn't actually write those words. There's a a famous line in 1 Corinthians where Paul is saying that women should be silent in churches, and if they've got a question, they should go home and ask their husbands. But it's the only part of Paul's letter which moves around in early manuscripts. It also says they should be in submission as the law also says, which is very un-Pauline. It's a very un-Pauline thing to say. He's also just said in 1 Corinthians that women should cover their hair when they prophesy, and then telling them that they can't speak at all. So there are lots of reasons to think that Paul didn't actually write those words. So I just want to sort of acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of sexism in Paul's letters, but say that there's good reason to suggest that Paul, the historical Paul, didn't write those words. 1 Timothy 2:12 is another example, but most scholars think that Paul didn't write the book of 1 Timothy altogether. However, we do know that Paul did write the letter to the Romans, and at the very end of the book of the epistle to the Romans, we find a pretty interesting indication of the position of women in early Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible chapter, and for me, it's the most interesting chapter in the whole thing. I mean, which is terrible. Poor old Paul would be absolutely flabbergasted that people find his list of people he knows in Rome far more interesting, maybe, than his great theological ideas in the rest of Romans. But this is a really important letter for Paul. He's writing to a church that he didn't found, and he's sort of laying out his theological understanding of the importance of Jesus and the place of Gentiles in this movement. So it's an incredibly important letter. And then he ends it by sort of adding on a list of names. I mean, he says, first of all, I commend this person. Then he says, greet this person, greet this person, greet this person. And so in a way, I mean, obviously it's a very carefully manufactured list of people, but it's as close as we're ever going to get to a snapshot of people in the early Roman church. And what's fascinating about it is that a third of those people are women. And they're women who are described as leaders of house churches. He kicks off with Prisca and Aquila. Prisca's name is always first before her husband Aquila. They are members of a house church, or they're leaders of a house church. He says that they've risked their necks for him. I would love to know what that was. What was that story? What's the story behind that? He talks about another woman called Junia, who has sometimes had her gender erased and been called Junias, and her partner or husband called Andronicus. He even says that they were apostles before him. They've been in prison for their faith, and they're kinsmen of him, he says. And he names a lot of women in that list. And one of the most interesting women is the very first one, the one he commends. He says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe. And so he's commending this person because she's not known to the Roman church. And the implication seems to be that she is the one carrying the letter. So she is bringing the letter. He says that she's a deacon of the church in Kentria, which is in Corinth. She's a benefactor of many, he says. And, she's a deacon. She's clearly a high-ranking woman in the church just outside Corinth. And she is bringing this letter to the Romans. And presumably she's not just handing it over because she knows Paul well. She's maybe reading it out, or maybe a slave is reading it out, and then she's going to explain it. What does Paul mean here? Well, this is what I think he's saying. So that, I think, is an incredible thing, given Paul's reputation. George Bernard Shaw said he was the eternal enemy of women. That doesn't sound like the eternal enemy of women, to have sent this important letter via a woman, and then for his whole sort of legitimacy to rest on saying hello to a third of women in this list. So I think that gives us a very different picture of Paul.
And the most interesting thing to me about this is that you're reading between the lines, as it were. It's not like Paul has written, by the way, women are really important.
Yeah.
We're just looking at the text and naturally seeing that, like a third of these names are women. And Romans chapter 16 opens, as you say, it says, this is the NIV, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon And that word deacon, I think, like diakonon or something like this.
Diakonos, which is, it just means, it can mean a kind of a leader, but it can also mean a servant, actually. It's different. And it's often translated as kind of a deacon or a leader when it's a male, and a servant when it's a female. But it's the same word. So clearly she's in some kind of leadership role in this church.
Well, the KJV will have servant rather than deacon.
Yes.
The thing that again, when you wrote in your book about this, I always think to myself, well, okay, well then we don't know. I mean, maybe Paul meant servant, maybe he meant something more like deacon. But the one thing you said, which I think is undoubtable, is that if he was talking about a man, it would have been translated as deacon. Regardless of whether we're correct in that translation or not, we know that that's how modern translators would translate it. So more and more people are beginning to use the word deacon here. And of course, in this early in the church, in the Christian church, the sort of organizational structure is still being like fleshed out. So it might not be clear exactly what it means to be a deacon or what that role entailed at that time, but we know that this Phoebe is incredibly important. So I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Kentrea. I don't know how to say that. Kentrea. Thank you. You can tell how much reading and how little talking I do by my absolute inability to pronounce names and places. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. Now, that does read like somebody saying, by the way, the woman who's bringing you this letter, take care of her and give her anything she needs, because she is incredibly important and she's helped out a lot of people, including me. She's risked her life for me. Like you say, this naturally reads as her coming in and bringing the letter and potentially being its first exegete. If that's the case, what I want to know is why we sort of see this development from an indication of an early church community where women were being sent out, possibly with Jesus' disciples, but certainly, by people like Paul, and were spreading the word of Jesus, to a modern church today, which sees the role of women as very specifically excluded or subordinate to that of men when it comes to the clergy at the very least, not allowed to be priests in the Catholic Church, for example, this kind of stuff. Historically, how this occurs. And I suppose sort of way into that is maybe to first talk about this character of Junia, who you mentioned a moment ago. She's mentioned in Romans chapter 16, along with presumably her husband, I think. And yet, if you read Martin Luther's translation of the Bible, it doesn't say Junia, it says Junias. What is that about? What's going on there?
Yeah, again, it's this really fascinating thing about gendered translation. So exactly in the same way that we'd said, if diakonos is a man, it's going to be translated leader. If it's a woman, it's going to be translated servant. In the case of Junias, it's because around about what Paul says about her is that greet Junias and Andronicus, they're kinspeople of him. And he says, they were apostles before me. So I think in the minds of the translators, apostles have to be men. There's no universe in which apostles are women. So even though there is no male name called, Junia is a very, very common female name. Lots and lots of women in the Roman world are called Junia. It's as common as Mary is in the Jewish world. So lots of women are called Junia. But they don't translate it by the obvious Junia. They assume that it must be male. And then they go looking for what male name could Junia possibly be. And they sort of invent this male name, Junias, which has no kind of basis in reality. It's just, but when you add an S to the end, it becomes a male name. And the Greek would kind of support it. It's just a question of where an accent goes. And of course, the earliest texts didn't have accents, so we can't know for sure. And so for a long time then, it was assumed that the correct reading here was Junias. And so this was a male. It was only really much, much later when people started looking at the various texts and saying, wait a minute here, there's no basis for this. And realizing that actually, that the better translation here is Junia. And the only reason why people weren't translating it as Junia was because of this reference to being an apostle. And perhaps the note too that they'd both been in prison. Perhaps people thought, maybe a woman wouldn't have been put in prison, though. I mean, we know that women could be put in prison just as easily as men. So it does seem to be really to do with nothing to do with the text itself, but entirely to do with the interpreters and their sense that a woman couldn't be an apostle. And once you make her into a female again, restore her femininity, then again, she becomes one of these gendered pairs, her and Andronicus, whether he's her husband or whether he's just this sort of missionary co-worker. Again, the two of them are prominent missionaries who Paul says go back to a very early time. They were apostles before he was. So maybe even from the days in Jerusalem, they've been part of this movement for a long, long time. But we would know nothing at all about them if it hadn't been for this tiny little reference here in Paul's letter to the Romans.
But even that motivation, you say that like exegetes are reading this and going, hold on, they're referred to as apostles, so this can't be a woman, it has to be a man. Even that is not quite clear, right? Because like the verse says, and this is Romans chapter 16, verse 7, greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews or fellow Israelites or kinsmen or whatever, who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. Now that word outstanding, that's the NIV, outstanding among the apostles, is a little bit ambiguous, right? Because the term is what, episimon or episomoi or something like that, which presumably is the same root as like epistle, because it means something like of note. And also that same word shows up when describing Barabbas, the prisoner,
the notorious, yes,
the notorious Barabbas, and it's the same word. So although you could read it as like Junia was outstanding among the apostles, that is, she was one of the apostles who was outstanding, it could also just mean that she was like notable among the apostles in that she was well regarded by the apostles. And so that reading of her being an apostle isn't actually that straightforward in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point that you're raising, and I hadn't realized that the NIV was translating it in that way. So yes, and I think that you can't really tell which way around it is. I think my sense is that it's translated as outstanding. Sort of she's counted as outstanding by the apostles. Is the way that it's translated by the people who don't want, who are happy enough to have her as a woman, but don't want to have her labeled as an apostle. And that's a kind of a middle position, I suppose. I don't think there's many people nowadays would want to argue that this is a male called Junias. That's not really a viable option nowadays. And the two main camps, I suppose, are the ones who just say, well, it's Junia and Andronicus, and they are outstanding among the apostles, and this includes them as apostles. Which would be my position. But there are, as you say, some people who would say that the apostles, the 12 males, regard them as outstanding. I think that's a less likely translation, and particularly coming from Paul. It would be different if it was Luke, because Luke reserves the term apostle just for the 12 and then the 11. I mean, he doesn't even want to call Paul an apostle. But Paul is very happy to call anybody an apostle, really. Anybody who's, been sent out with a mandate of any kind. So I can't really see why Paul would sort of not include them as apostles. That seems unlikely to me. But you're absolutely right. There is that sort of slight get out clause there if you're uncomfortable with Junia being an apostle.
At the very least, what we do know it definitely says is that they were in Christ before Paul was. And given that Paul is a pretty early convert to Christianity as far as converts go, like if these two figures, at least one of whom being Junior, were in Christ before Paul was. It means that we're dealing with very, very early followers of Jesus, possibly even people who followed him while he was still alive, because we're talking about like so early in the development of Christianity here that whatever you think of their position, as apostles or not, and you rightly point out that Paul uses the word apostle a lot more loosely. So it actually wouldn't be that like crazy for him to call a woman an apostle. But regardless of whether he did that or not, these are early important believers who Paul thought were worth mentioning in Romans chapter 16 at the very least, right?
And presumably, because they've been followers for such a long time, they have a certain preeminence in the Roman community. People are probably looking up to them, and Paul says they're kinspeople, which probably means that they're Jewish. So they're Jewish like him. So they may well be from Judea originally, somewhere like that, or Galilee. So they are probably quite prominent within the church in Rome.
I did want to ask you briefly, and I should also mention like the way that we're the way that we're trying to sort of go back in time here and look at like who are the real figures behind these stories and these names and what's really going on is what you do on your podcast, Biblical Time Machine, literally sort of trying to go back in time.
We go back in time. Yes, we do.
You and David Ruse, is that how you say his name? David Ruse?
Yes.
You've got your own show and people. I think that I like to consider my show as a bit of a sort of door for people to get into biblical scholarship if they're interested in it. But of course, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I talk about lots of things. I do philosophy, I do a bit of Bible, I do a bit of this and a bit of that. But if this is your jam, people listening, if you're into this kind of stuff, then stop listening to me and go and listen to Dr. Bond and Dr. Roos as well. Perhaps not Dr. Roos.
We look at everything to do with the Bible, Hebrew Bible, and the earliest stuff that we can get right through to the New Testament, and anything to do with the Bible and its offshoots, films and other things like that, and have guests. That's one of the exciting things for me, actually, too, to you can get a little bit in your own narrow world, but it's really exciting to hear, what are the latest things that people are saying about the Hebrew Bible or different parts of the New Testament that I don't look at much. So, always something different.
Well, one of the ways that we can go back in time is, of course, to look at the earliest manuscripts. But another way is literally, like physically, to look at something like archaeology. Like archaeology is a sort of way of going back in time. If you step into an ancient ruin or something, you really feel like you're stepping into the time period, and there might even be like etchings on the wall from the time period that are there today as they were when they were originally written. And in the documentary that I've already mentioned once that you made with Joan Taylor, I forget the name of the documentary. Was it also called Women Remembered?
No, it was called Jesus's Female Disciples, The New Evidence.
Yes. Yeah. And you can watch the whole thing on YouTube, actually, and it's about an hour long, and I would recommend it to people. One of the things you do is you visit the catacombs of Milan. You go to this...
Naples.
Oh, is it Naples?
Yeah,
okay, so you're in Naples, and under the ground there are these huge, like, cave systems. And at some point, I think in the last few decades or something, there was some renovation work done in these catacombs underneath Naples, and something really interesting was discovered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, female bishops that go. Yeah, it's incredible. They are catacombs, and we went there with art historian Ali Kachus, who has done a lot of work on these. So she was really showing us round here. And there's a couple of them, but the one that really sort of stands out is the one of Chirola, her name is. And so there's a sort of a place where she's presumably buried. And then on top of that, there's this sort of arch-shaped painting. It's quite large. And like you say, it's been renovated lately, but, very skillfully and only based on what's there already. And you can tell from the iconography that this woman is a bishop. She's wearing sort of a bishop's robes. There's also copies of books, which are the Gospels, and there's sort of flames coming up from them. All of these apparently are signs of being a bishop, and certainly in other art historical contexts like this, if you get this iconography, people would say straight away, oh, this is a bishop. The difficulty here is it's a female, and so again, is she really a bishop? But there seems to be no reason to doubt it. And I think
Yeah.
what's really fascinating about this, it's from the 6th century Naples. This is a time when the church has already very much kind of changed. It's moved from that sense that, the end of the world is about to be here, as you have in Paul, and that sort of egalitarian mission to get out, get everybody into the church before the end of the world comes. And that realization that it's not going to come quite so soon, and we need to kind of get used to being in the world and look sensible and, look respectable to outsiders. And you've got the creeds now formulated. You've got the church fathers, and you're now in this world where the men are very much in charge. And yet here in Naples, you've got a female bishop. So I think what's really interesting about discoveries like this is that it really does kind of put little pinholes in the normal narrative, the narrative that men gradually took over. That might be generally the right story, but it's important to realize that wasn't happening everywhere. There were little pockets where women were still able to exercise a certain amount of authority in these churches. And if Cirulla, then probably other women too. We shouldn't necessarily think that the women's voices have been completely stamped out.
And this image of Cirulla, which is discovered, I mean, to the untrained eye, it's a picture of a woman with some Gospels floating above her. And for those watching on YouTube, I'll have put it on screen, or my wonderful editor will have done so. And you might think to yourself, oh, okay, but like, how do we know this? And one of the things that Ali, I forget her, Ali
Cattus, I think I'm saying
Ali
it right.
Cattus,
I'm not sure.
The art historian who you go to the catacombs with points out is that, well, she points to the writings of Severian of Gabala or Gabala, who is an important 4th, 5th century preacher and bishop. And he writes about the ordination process of bishops and how these Gospels, the open books, are held above the bishops when they're being, when the sort of ordination is happening, the Gospels are held above them. And I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. You've got these Gospels held above the woman like it's an ordination of a bishop. But then he specifically writes that this is so that the flames of the Holy Spirit will come out of the Gospels and inspire the bishops. He tells us that that's why the books are held open. And what do we see in this image? We see flames coming out of the Gospels. I mean, just a fascinating indication of female bishops. And she also points out in this documentary that the timing of this painting, I don't know what you call it, a painting, a fresco, I don't know what, I can't remember what it is. Yeah. A fresco, the timing of it is around the time when Pope Gelasius in the late 5th century writes a letter to bishops in southern Italy complaining about women ministering at the holy altar, complaining that women are having too much authority in churches. So we've got this letter from the Pope saying women have got too much authority in the churches. We've got this sort of artistic indication of women being ordained as bishops. We've also, and this is 5th century, right? So we've also got much earlier in Paul and the Romans indications of women being sent out and possible women deacons and maybe described as apostles. And then at some point around about here, it just changes. Suddenly, the art changes. Suddenly, the position of women in church changes. Why do we go from this evidence of women in high positions of authority in the church to suddenly not to be present at all?
Well, I mean, this is one of the big questions, and there are lots of different answers to that. I mean, one is that when the accession of Constantine, when Constantine became emperor and then converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, this would be that he favored this more sort of militant branch of Christianity that favored men rather than women in these roles. Another explanation that I quite like is that around about this time, the purpose of bishops and leaders was more to or equally important part of it was oratory and being able to argue your case against non-believers. And it just happened to be the case that fewer women were were educated anyway, and certainly few of them were trained as orators. And so it just sort of naturally happened that the ones who were sort of rising to the top in ecclesial circles were the ones with this higher level of training. And probably a variety of reasons in different places. But I think you can always, at all points in history, you can point to some women who were moving outside of the norm for their gender, and clearly, once the sort of monastic movements get going, you have women in cloisters, you have women mystics. You can always point to some indication of women exercising some kind of leadership or some kind of theological role. But yeah, broadly speaking, sometime around about the sort of the 4th to the 6th century, women's participation very much kind of begins to decline.
One of the really interesting things that Ali Katoots is how you say it. I'm afraid I don't know how to pronounce her name. One of the things that she then talks to you about from her work as a historian of art and sort of ancient Christian artwork is specifically tracking the depiction of the raising of Lazarus, right? Because it's one of the most commonly, it's one of the most commonly depicted scenes. I think particularly it was like on people's graves or something, or like on
sarcophagi,
tombs.
Because it's to do with resurrection. Yeah.
So Jesus, John's gospel tells us that Jesus hears that Lazarus has died. This is where Jesus famously weeps for his friend Lazarus, and then he comes and he raises him from the dead. And there are women present, right? It's Martha and Jesus' mother are the two which are named as present at the raising of Lazarus.
No, it's Martha and Mary. They're said to be the sisters of Lazarus.
Martha and Mary. That's right.
John's
Sorry, not
gospel,
Mary, the mother of God. Martha and Mary.
Yeah.
Of Lazarus's relation, and they're in the text. We know that they're there. And she shows us, I think, I don't know the exact dates, but we're looking at like some kind of 3rd century engraving. And you have all of the characters, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and Martha and Mary are stood there with the disciples. And then you get a little bit later, and Mary is still there, but Martha isn't, or vice versa.
There's just one woman,
Yeah, and then you get a little bit further, and then it looks like the women aren't there at all, except one is there. It's just that she's this gremlin-looking creature in the bottom left corner who's been shrunk down to this tiny size, just about making it into the frame. And then eventually, around, I guess, like the 4th or 5th century, you start seeing depictions of the raising of Lazarus, which just don't include the women at all. And you can literally see this progression from the women, both of them being present, just like the disciples, getting smaller, and finally disappearing altogether. This is like an art historian's explicit depiction of the literal erasure of women from the story of the New Testament. And I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely fascinating to see them shrinking and the very small little Mary or Martha, whichever one it is. It looks like a little hedgehog, and you think, why even bother to put it in when she's so small? And then, of course, like you say, she just sort of disappears. But that one that we looked at in the documentary was a really clear one, but there are other ones too. We looked at a lot of we filmed so much stuff that didn't get into the documentary actually, and we were in the Vatican Museum looking at various other sarcophagi there. And again, it's a very similar picture. You look at sort of ones from about the 3rd century, which is about as early as you get Christian sarcophagi, and they have representations of women. by the 4th, 5th century, suddenly they've disappeared altogether, and they're just not part of the narrative. And that's a really important thing, given that most of the people who are looking at these can't read, so they are understanding their biblical texts by looking at representations like this, like the things on sarcophagi, like, other examples of Christian art, perhaps in sort of, meeting places as they're generally sort of becoming more a thing. And so if people are sort of remembering or being told the story through these images, there's just no women there. So again, I think that just kind of reinforces that idea that this is a story about men doing things.
Yeah, and the documentary opens with you in the square, in St. Peter's Square, right outside St. Peter's Basilica, the heart of the Catholic Church. And there are these glorious statues, almost too many statues. And given that there are just so many of them on the square, it is incredible to think that not one of them is a statue of a woman. There is no depiction of a woman except for one tiny little mosaic of Mary. And the reason that's there, I spotted it when I was at the Vatican recently. And my friend told me this, I didn't realize, but you might see if you're there, it's sort of, if you're facing the church, it's off on the right, up high. Little mosaic of Mary on the wall. And that was put there at the request of Pope John Paul II, after his assassination attempt. So somebody shot John Paul II at very close range in St. Peter's Square, I think in like the 80s or something. Yeah, 1981. And the Pope survived, and it was surprising that he survived. And I think it was like on the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, and so the Pope thanked Our Lady of Fatima for guiding the bullet to miss his vital organs. I think it was Christopher Hitchens who wondered why Our Lady of Fatima couldn't have guided the bullet to miss him altogether, but that's besides the point. And the way my friend told this to me was that, like, when he thought he might be dying, he wants to pray to Mary, and he looks up and realizes that he was amazed. There's no depiction even of Mary. And for Catholics, that's saying something, that there isn't a statue of Mary or a painting somewhere. There was nothing. And so whether it was in that moment he realized it or sometime afterwards, the Pope realizes that there is not a single depiction of Mary. And so he insists that this tiny little mosaic goes up in the corner, and that's all you've got. And I mean, I think that kind of embodies what we're talking about, doesn't it? It's like, it's all men in huge, grand statues. And firstly, nobody even notices at first that there aren't any women. And then finally, when they become like unavoidably relevant, they go, oh gosh, we better stick them up there in the corner and at least include them a little bit, right? And I think in so many ways, that's kind of what's happening in the Gospels.
Yeah. I think the Gospels are different. I mean, they do include a lot more women than that. I mean, I don't think they've sort of got to the stage where they're just telling the story about what men are doing. And I mean, there's enough just left in the Gospels for us to be able to reconstruct a different history, or at least a more sort of variegated history by including women and women's experiences. But I think it's really interesting that, when you want a woman, you go to the Virgin Mary, in the Catholic Church. I mean, there's plenty of other women as well that could. And at the end of the documentary, we get CGI to kind of take off the male representations and put women up there and in St. Peter's Basilica instead. And there's plenty of them. It's just that it's just where you look and the stories you hear and the representations you see. And these things are all so important. And I think just gradually over the years, the women have just dropped out of this.
Which is why I think the name of your book is such a brilliant one, because you could so easily name the book something like, a reassessment of women in Christianity or so. But no, it's women remembered, because the point is not so much that they've been exactly just like erased, or maybe it's not even, some of it might not even be conscious. It might just be due to unconscious bias or whatever. But for some reason, despite these indications of they're important in the early church, it's like they've just been forgotten, which is why I think your book is so interesting. And it is amazing to think that there is a book's worth and a documentary's worth of material around these people who are so scantily mentioned. There's just like so much to say about them. And so, of course, if people are interested, I've already mentioned the podcast, but specifically this topic, that book will also be linked in the description as well. phenomenal, and a great cover too. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I really like the cover, and again, the cover just really sort of captures that sense of piecing together fragments and the mosaic of it all. But I mean, one of the reasons we wrote the book was because we felt with the documentary we'd only just scratched the surface. The documentary only looks at 4 different women, I think it is, and really not in a great deal of depth. So we thought there's so much more that we could say. And the book only really sort of takes you to the end of the New Testament period. Very interesting stuff to explore beyond that 2nd century to the 5th or 6th century, as we've been discussing, is I think a really crucial time in all of this. So we have thought about doing another book, but just not got around to it yet.
Yeah, I think it would be great. I mean, even from what we've been talking about here, and of course the documentary, you can only scratch the surface. We haven't talked about the woman with the flow of blood who touches Jesus's garment and gets healed. We haven't talked about the anointing woman. We haven't talked about like Martha, really. We talked about her a little bit in the context of art, like Martha and Mary, Tabitha. There's so many wonderful female characters in the New Testament who don't get enough attention.
I mean, I think Prisca actually was probably far more important than Luke suggests. I mean, every time you see her going first to a new area, preparing the way, and then, Paul comes and says, I founded this church. And you think, you didn't at all. Prisca was already there, busying herself. But it's like so many things, people don't remember what the women did. It's just when the big guy comes in that he sort of throws his weight around.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this podcast and books like yours can begin to rectify that historic injustice. If people are interested, it's all in the description. Helen Bond, thanks so much for coming on. It's been great.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our chat.